Yeah. Here we go. All right, we are back in session, and for our next item is on the Special Committee on Digital Learning and Computer Sciences, and I'll turn to the chair of that committee, Lieutenant Governor Forrest.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, everybody. Well, this today is going to be the culmination of a steering committee that we established to talk about computer science standards in North Carolina when we asked the board and chairman to put together a special committee on computer science. The whole purpose behind that was to make it a priority in our state. We find ourselves in North Carolina maybe in the middle of the pack, but probably well behind much of the country when it comes to teaching computer science in an effective way for students to go out and get jobs. I think, as everybody here knows, we've talked about this before, there's some 27,000 jobs on the market at any given time in North Carolina related to computer science. Some $1.5 billion plus in salaries out there for those jobs, and we do not have the appropriate pipeline to ensure that our students are ready for those jobs. So this steering committee that was put together is a combination of folks from DPI, from the Friday Institute, SAS, Red Hat, Pendo, North Carolina School of Science and Math, and other businesses, but it's a combination of reaching out to the business community and the education community and making sure that we are addressing all the appropriate needs for the jobs that are out there today, the kinds of things that they need. And I think this is the kind of thing, as a state board, that we need to focus on more, and that's being very nimble. As the Department of Public Instruction being nimble, as a state board being nimble, but just as an education establishment being as nimble as we possibly can at an ever-increasing pace of life out there when jobs are changing and the skill levels are changing and those types of things. How do we, in the education space, provide the type of training and tools, education curriculum standards for these students at a very rapid pace? And so it's about efficiency and being nimble and that sort of thing. And I think that's what we will see from this presentation today. So I'm going to turn it over to Fridays. No, I'm going to turn it over to Mary. And Mary's going to get us kicked off here and lead this discussion for us. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lieutenant Governor. Thank you, Chairman Davis, as well as esteemed members of the board, State Superintendent Johnson, and all those who have convened today. I'm excited to bring an update from the Computer Science Steering Committee and all of the hard work they have done toward the North Carolina Computer Science Initiative. When we start to talk about the Computer Science Committee and the Steering Committee in general, they were formed this year, January 2019, under the State Board Special Committee of Digital Learning and Computer Science. Now, their purpose was to lead the process of ensuring that we have high quality computer science training and education that would be available to all students K through 12 throughout our state. Their first goal was to vet and present computer science standards to the state board by the end of this school year, so we're right on target with that goal. This particular group brought a very unique energy and insight to the table, and they represent cross-sector expertise at their best. Not only as a collective, but also as individuals, they bring expertise from education, business, nonprofits, and they are truly devoted to fully expanding and engaging this computer science opportunities that are available through all students, not only in North Carolina, but also nationally and internationally. As we look here, we see the cross-sector collaboration with local, state, and national perspectives. Now, again, each of the members that are represented on the Computer Science Steering Committee represent a plethora of organizations. We see here community colleges, as well as districts, school districts here in North Carolina, nonprofit organizations, as well as the economic industries that are truly committed to computer science initiatives, as well as talking about IBM, SAS, and Google. And these are some of the entities and organizations that are truly making their mark in computer science and leading the way for the research that's happening across the state as well as across our country. These individuals, starting with Kathleen Dawson, Chief Innovation Officer of Guilford County Schools, she has already started to lead the charge when it comes to putting computer science in K through 12. Their district has really taken a stance to be an early adopter of this initiative and making sure that all of their students in grades kindergarten through seniors in high school are really able to be exposed and immersed in computer science opportunities. Deborah Seahorn, who we're happy to have here today, Her dedication as a retired educator, CTE consultant, has been invaluable to the steering committee. She's also the past interim executive director of CSTA, who developed the standards in 2017. Russell Strand Poole is a current computer science teacher in Durham Public Schools. His perspective and lens from the teacher leader perspective was amazing on the steering committee because he too has taught computer science in elementary, middle, and high school. Abby Olukie, who is the founder of Smart Girls HQ, she is devoted to making sure that girls have positive experiences with computer science early so that they can make decisions as they move through elementary and middle school before they get to high school about what type of computer science initiatives they want to be involved in. She also has worked with a lot of technology companies as well as been featured on podcasts for making sure that historically marginalized populations are represented in the CS space as well. Brooke Osborne, Education Program Manager at Code.org. They are the leaders nationally of everything coding, and they already have an avid presence here in North Carolina. Tom Looney, former executive of IBM and Lenovo, he brings a continental lens to this work, and he has really been an advocate for the economic partners and industries, making sure that they're ready for this work, and they are. A lot of the companies that we were able to meet at, and that is one of the beauties of the steering committee. We were able to meet at Pendo here in Raleigh, Red Hat, and SAS. They're not only leading the work in computer science, but they're ready to partner with this initiative, and we're happy to give us this space to have this conversation. Scott McQuiggan, Director of Curriculum Pathways at SAS. Again, they're one of the leaders nationwide in innovative analytics and data management. Chris Stevenson, Head of Computer Science at Google. She is the nationwide leader when it comes to all things computer science and really helped us hone in on what that statewide definition of computer science is going to be in North Carolina. And last but not least, Juan Vargas. He is the Dean and Vice President of Education at Emphasis, which is a global leader in technology services. So you see that here we have a depth and breadth of experiences from across those different industries, educational entities, so that we truly were able to have a great, rotund, and comprehensive conversation around this work. Multi-agency staff and support was critical in terms of making sure the Friday Institute, DPI, as well as the Office of Lieutenant Governor have walked alongside this process to provide insight as well as support and resources to make sure that the steering committee was able to look at all implications, potential challenges, and concerns. Starting with the Friday Institute, they were invaluable in making sure that the research and partners that undergirded this work was current and also helped us to really frame what's happening with the professional development that they provide for teacher leaders across the state. The Office of the Lieutenant Governor were able to provide constituents and business partners, which helped us have an economic lens around this work of computer science and the potential impact for our state. And last but not least, DPI, the staff, the divisions, and the departments were able to come around the table so that we could really shine a light about some of the great things that are already happening in computer science across our state, where were some natural opportunities for integration, and they also helped us navigate potential challenges and concerns. And here you can see some of the individuals who have been responsible for that work and making sure that multi-agency staff and support was there. Jamie Falkenberry, myself, Dave Fry, and Sam Morris. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dave Fry, the Senior Director of Computer Science Initiatives at the Friday Institute.
Thank you, Mary. I think I win the contest for most words in my title, but I'm going to work on that. I'll see if I can make it longer and more confusing. I had the pleasure of working with this group, and it's just an amazing group, as Mary said. We feel fortunate to have the opportunity to move these things forward. I spent a lot of time both in the state, across the state, and around the country, learning about what's happening in computer science and helping to inform that. And I can just say this has been a fantastic group to work with. I get to talk about what we actually did and what we learned from the process. And the most important thing is, what is computer science and what isn't computer science, especially in the context of what we do in these in schools. So computer science, we looked at a number of definitions. There are definitions that range from computers and everything related to them, which is the original definition, 1967, that came out, to things that are 400 words long. We landed kind of in the middle. This is a widely accepted definition of computer science. I highlighted computing systems in red because it's a word we changed. This was written in 2003, and it was the study of algorithmic processes and computers. We believe as a group that computers are no longer the answer. It's computing systems It's the phone in your pocket. It's what your phone connects to. It's every other thing. It's the Internet of Things. It's all these computer systems. It's probably connected to some of y'all's fridge. So yes, there are computing systems out there as opposed to computers. But this is about their principles, their hardware, their software designs, their applications, and the impact on society. So not just the technical. In the context of schools, what isn't computer science? So we talk about computer literacy, we talk about information technology, we talk about computational thinking, and we have this great Venn diagram, multicolored representation, which is not necessarily to scale, but it shows you how these things overlap. So we talk about computer literacy all the time, and there's a bit of computer literacy, knowing how to use the computer, that is necessary and a component of computer science, but there's a lot of computer literacy that is not computer science. In information technology, there's a lot of overlap there, but that is more of an industrial application of computer science. That's where people learn about networking systems and how to build the infrastructure around our computing systems. And then computational thinking, there's a lot of that is embedded in computer science, but I would say that the people in science, the people in math, they would all say we also own computational thinking because it is simply a decision-making process. So it is part of a lot of what kids do every day and all day, but it is certainly part of computer science. So our process over the last 5 months was both intensive and quick, but we started with the CSTA standards. The CSTA stands for the Computer Science Teachers Association, and they have some well-established standards that we built from to make sure they work in North Carolina. Why do we look at standards? If we go back to 2017-18, there was a report to the General Assembly from Lieutenant Governor and State Superintendent to recommendations to expand computer science opportunities to all students in K-12 North Carolina schools. Within that report, the first recommendation is that we need rigorous computer science content standards, and the reason is without those we cannot have high-quality computer science curriculum, we cannot have pathways, they become the framework for how we move this forward. And you'll see a little later as we're talking about this, one of the issues is there's lots of things happening in North Carolina, but we don't know if they're good or bad because there's literally no framework to put that together. So when somebody has a great idea, things happen, but that's not necessarily helpful to all kids in all schools. As I said, it was fairly intensive. We have over 1,000 person hours of work so far in the last 5 months, and I would say that's a conservative estimate, but I didn't want to overestimate. That's the committee digging in, over 500 person hours there. Our team and the team at DPI digging in and doing research and looking at what else is happening out there, as well as engaging with other stakeholders and experts around the state and the country to get their ideas. And as we started to kind of come together on something, make sure we didn't miss something, we weren't going kind of off the rails. But I would say a lot of work has been done in a short period of time, which is both exciting and a little exhausting. So our process, step one, we start with these established standards. So the CSTA standards were developed over a 2-year process, 2016-17, national experts in computer science education, vetting process that worked with educators at all levels over that time. There's also a national framework for computer science education, and they worked very hard to align with that framework that gives directions to standards developers as well as curriculum and PD providers and things like that. One of the great assets we have is 2 members of our standards, or our steering committee, were part of that process. Deborah Seahorn, who was mentioned earlier, she was the chair of that process, that 2-year process. Her insights were invaluable, of course. We were basically taking her work and tweaking it and making it a little different. So she was fantastic in that regard. And I would like to just acknowledge Deborah. She was the one who introduced me to computer science education. And as a retired educator, everyone knows Deborah, and they believe her when she says things because she's done all the work. She's been there in all these things, and she's retired, and she still led this process. So she's been a real asset for us, and just fortunate that she happens to be living in North Carolina and is dedicated to the state.
We want to recognize her and
Oh, yeah,
the audience,
Deborah,
have
would you
her
like to
stand
stand up?
up so we can,
Thank you, Deborah.
yeah, thank you.
I've been to several meetings where someone says, "Oh, you know Deborah." Okay. And it's good. I'm good. People believe me. So she is really quite something. So we built from these standards. They're comprehensive. They cover 5 big areas of computer science, everything from systems to networks and the internet to data analysis, algorithms of programming, and impacts of computing. And I should say that these established standards are used in a number of states. I believe there are over 30 states now that are using these standards with some adaptations. They're used by curriculum designers and professional development providers. I personally work with Code.org nationally as one of their chairs for their advisory committee. And they have taken all of the content and all the courses they've built and already mapped them to these standards. So one of the perks of starting with this was we knew that once we got our standards in place, we were that much closer to having a crosswalk with some of the most commonly used curriculum out there. So felt like a good place to start, and we started there. We also took a look at what are standards and what grades are important, and what is the scope of this idea of standards. And originally we thought we'll just do 9-12, and the more we dug into it, we realized there is a path here that starts early on. And looking at those CSTA standards that start in kindergarten, in order to reach the kids when they make decisions, you've got to push that down. You got to start earlier. You got to give kids a chance to engage in some of these things before 9th grade. So the committee was pretty adamant that we need to start in kindergarten, and we need to take a look at whether that's going to be overwhelming or not. But we need to get a good plan to do that and make sure that there's kind of adequate implementation planning and timing and guidance for schools. But without that K-12 approach, we kind of lose a lot of kids long before they have a chance to engage in computer science. The crux of our work, the biggest amount of time we put in was reviewing and adjusting these standards, and there's a 3-part process we went through. First was to identify whether the standards were appropriate for whom as a student. So our first couple of meetings, we dug into all 124 of those standards. Everyone on the committee rated them, whether they're appropriate for all students. Is that something all students should learn? Is this something that students should learn when they get into a computer science class, like an intro class, something designed to engage more students? Or is that something that just students who are in kind of a path and an intensive computer science focused course should really be addressing? 37 of those standards we looked at, we weren't certain. As a group, we kind of debated whether those were not, who they should be appropriate for. That took us to part B of this process, which is, of those 37, we kind of went through this four-part process of keep, edit, move, or delete. So we want to keep this standard where it's at. Do we want to move it to another grade level because it's either too easy or too hard? Do we want to edit it for clarity? Do we want to edit it to make it more sense for a teacher? Or do we just want to get rid of it? We all agree that this is terrible. I don't think we deleted any of them, which is both good or bad, depending on your perspective. But most of the moving and editing happened either for clarity or grade appropriateness. So there were times when it felt like this is not something kids should learn in 5th grade, they should learn it in 8th grade. There were times when it was something that read as 8th grade, and we thought, I think 3rd graders are doing that. So we moved those around a little bit. And there was just some language changes that were not clear to us. And as CS educators, if they're not clear to us, we don't think new people coming into the space would really understand them. So we cleaned some of that up. There were a few that were much more extensive changes. And I have 2 examples of those because I think they help to clarify what we're talking about here. This is one of those examples of why it's not clear what a standard is. And we changed it to make it more sense for people. So in the CSTA standards, there was a standard in grades 11 and 12 to categorize the roles of operating system software. As a teacher who's never done anything computer science related, I'm not sure what you want me to categorize or how to categorize those things and what exactly that means. The committee decided that the better way to handle that is in an intro to computer science course, having students describe how computing devices manage and allocate their shared resources. It's much more direct. It clarifies for everyone what students actually should be able to demonstrate, what they should learn, as opposed to something that was pretty vague. Second example we have is more around when we get into the high school space, the committee decided that there needs to be paths for students to engage in computer science beyond just programming. And computer science is embedded in a lot of fields. So the CSTA standard on the left, there's a lot of words here that I didn't understand the first day, using version control systems, integrated development environments, and collaborative tools and practices and code documentation in a group software project. However, kids may not do a software project, and kids might be building a robot. Kids may be doing some cybersecurity. Kids might be working with AI. So we shifted that to be more appropriate and fit across all those kind of domains within computer science to say students would use industry-appropriate collaborative tools and processes when working on a team to construct a computational artifact, and a computational artifact meaning any type of product that comes from a computing device. So it gave us some flexibility there where teachers could engage and not feel like they had to figure out what an IDE is and how to apply it to the activities my kids are doing. The last part of this process is to rethink the kind of the way the CSTA standards were organized. Again, this was for clarity. In the K-8 space, the CSTA standards were built around levels. And those levels were 1A, 1B, and 2. Not exactly sure why they weren't 1, 2, and 3, or why they weren't 1A, 1B, 1C. But they were 1A, 1B, 1, 2, or in 2. We shifted those to grade bands because when you dug into them, they were actually already grade banded. So our recommendation was to shift that into K2, 3.5, and 6.8. At the high school level, there were two 3A, 3B standard levels. It wasn't clear what you do with those or if they were grade specific, and we shifted that into being course-based, much like you see in science. So when there's an Intro to CS course, depending on when you take that, 9th grade, 10th grade, 11th grade, there's a set of standards that align to what students should learn during that course. When you move into more advanced CS discipline-specific courses, like a AI class or cybersecurity class, there's a set of standards that you should cover within those courses. We could imagine there could be a third one someday, but we didn't want to get into that because it's a long way off, I think, to get to that advanced level at the high school for most students in most schools. So again, shifting from being two kind of generic levels to course specific. There's an intro course which already exists in the state and is being used widely. And then there's the beginnings in different counties of more discipline specific things around robotics, around cybersecurity, around programming. And we reestablished that so that there's some alignment there, again, to make sure this high quality education, these courses are meeting the needs of our students. I should say one last thing on that. The CTE division is already doing a lot on this, and this aligns with pathways, right? So the committee also thought this is not a pathway in computer science for students. There are many pathways in computer science for students, and those go into different career fields, right? Computer science isn't just one career field. So again, we wanted that to reflect the options, create these standards so there are options for a school, a community college, however people are mapping and thinking about pathways to set up students to go into something that's more specific as they get farther up. So they take an Intro to CS course. Now you can say, I really love cybersecurity. I'm totally into this. I can go that way if a course is offered. But now I have a way to do that. And again, it aligns very closely with what CTE has already done and what they continue to expand on around the computer science space. So in summary, we kind of went through this quick process over 5 months, which was starting with great things, right? In the yellow up on the screen, we build from these widely accepted standards that they took 2 years building with lots of great insight from very bright people. We also brought together this amazing committee to vet those and give feedback. We went through this kind of cyclical process around reviewing, editing, making them clear, looking at the research, looking at what other states did and stealing some of their language, and then organizing it correctly to align with both the CTE stuff and the way our courses are laid out and what we've already started to adopt. That has led us to some potential North Carolina computer science standards that the committee thinks are a way to move forward. With that in mind, I'll hand it back to Mary. She'll talk to you a little bit about those suggested recommendations from the steering committee.
Thank you, Dave. So per their charge, the steering committee came up with suggested recommendations, and we really and truly followed an iterative process to develop those recommendations. It was a collaborative process, and all of the support agencies were truly involved to ensure that those recommendations were well informed by multiple stakeholders. So first, coming together to discuss and come to a consensus on the recommendations. Then, of course, going to staff research and reaching out to DPI and the state board based on the rules, the policy, and the possible implications for what those recommendations could mean. And last but not least, the committee and staff discussed potential updates and suggestions until an agreement was met. So it was truly one of the collaborative cycles that we want to see when we talk about the North Carolina Computer Science Initiative itself. Economic, industry, and educational partners coming together with a problem statement and saying what is the best way for us to go about doing this. So the steering committee came up with these suggested recommendations based on standards, guidance, and policy. And throughout this policy, of course, the guidance and the support of multiple agencies was involved, and the implications were also taken back not only to the Office of Lieutenant Governor, as well as State Board, but also DPI. And finally taking it back to the steering committee so that we could have a conversation about what would be the potential challenges and concerns around these three ends. So we finally decided on these final recommendations to the State Board. First, to amend the necessary State Board policies to allow computer science to become a North Carolina standard course of study by August 2019. Second, granting permission for the development of North Carolina Computer Science Framework and Implementation Plan to support the North Carolina Computer Science Initiative by April 2020. Third, to grant permission to move forward with the further development of the K-12 Computer Science Standards by April 2020. And last, approving computer science as a North Carolina standard course of study by April 2020. Now, when we start to dig into the first recommendation, amending the necessary state board policies to allow computer science to become a part of the North Carolina Standard Course of Study, at the last update that was given to the board suggested that we put together the policies that would be directly impacted by making sure that computer science was in all schools. So we've started to look at some of those policies, namely the board policy Standard Course of Study 012, which really looks at the revision, the review, and implementation of standards and policies. So that would be one of the policies that we would like to present based on moving forward next month and then in August of 2019 to make sure that the policies from the state board really undergird and underpin the foundation of this initiative as a whole. Second, and this is really where we start to see the bulk of the work, in terms of the North Carolina Computer Science Framework and Implementation Plan by April 2020, computer science is an ecosystem. And as we start to develop curriculum in this implementation plan, particularly in K-8, as Dave mentioned, when students get to high school, they need to be able to make sound decisions about which pathway through computer science they would like to be on, whether it's cybersecurity, data analysis, IT. So looking at the K-8 grade level recommendations, we want to create ecosystems that are localized, where students are using resources that are in their backyard. When we talk about computer science in Asheville or in Wilmington or here in the Research Triangle Park, those are very different experiences for students based on their insight, their expertise, their knowledge, their backgrounds, and their demographic groups. So we want to make sure that the ecosystems that we build are undergirded by this implementation plan. High level high school course offerings and future pathways to meet their standards. High level middle school course offerings to meet those standards. Again, this is about making sure that students in K through 5 are immersed in the language of computer science, and then in middle school they're able to be involved and explore, and then by high school they're able to choose that pathway. K-8 grade level recommendations. This will involve bringing teacher leaders to the table to really say what are some natural connections and crosswalks between English language arts, math, science, and social studies where those computer science already fit in. Digital information and technology and media sources, as well as doing a roadmap and examples of K-8 integration. As we mentioned, there are already some counties who are doing some amazing things with computer science. We want to highlight those, and the things that they're doing, we want to put those in that toolbox and arsenal so that teachers, leaders, and students across the state can see the good things that are already happening. Professional development recommendations, as well as district school planning strategies and implementations and timelines for that implementation. Why did we choose April 2020? We felt that that was a good time because for those early adopters, they're going to be able to have that framework going into the 2020-21 school year so that that will serve as a foundation for the work that's already happening. And for those districts that want to begin the work, they're going to be able to prepare over the summer and at the end months of school for the 2020-21 school year with this implementation guide and the supporting documents that will be involved in this particular initiative. Granting permission for the K-12 computer science standards. Currently, we've utilized the CSTA standards as a springboard, as Dave mentioned, for a strong foundation for our North Carolina Computer Science Initiative. Now, these standards were vetted nationally over 2 years, and 30 plus states have already adopted these standards and have created, amended, and revised a policy to fit the standards. So that falls in line with what we're asking from the state board today too, to amend the policies to undergird that process. Also, we want to make sure that these standards go through the formal standards review process here, make sure that we're convening the writing team, going through revising, editing, and taking them out to the field, bringing teacher leaders, student leaders, and district leaders to the table to get their feedback as we move forward with creating these standards for this initiative. And then last but not least, approving computer science as a North Carolina Standard Course of Study by April 2020. The Standard Course of Study currently does not involve or include computer science as an academic discipline. So we know that by developing this framework, taking the standards through the formal standards review process, we're going to be able to ensure that all North Carolina students in grades K through 12 are exposed to and immersed in the opportunities to chart the course for their future. So what are our next steps in terms of this summer, particularly gaining additional insights on these standards and how they can create opportunities for students throughout the state? The 1,000+ hours that have already been put in by the steering committee helps to jumpstart this work. So making sure that we're amending those policies so that we can follow the formal process is going to be the next step in ensuring that we have exposure throughout the state. Targeting stakeholders who are already engaged in computer science at all levels, not only bringing the DPI staff back to the table in all subject areas and divisions is going to be necessary so that we make sure we have every policy that's been implicated by this, but also so that we can understand how do we make sure that we have a reach with advanced learning and CTE. How do we integrate and collaborate in the same vein that the steering committee has so that we can create more opportunities for more of our 1.5 million students to be affected. Teachers at elementary, middle, and high school levels are going to be invaluable. We know that at the elementary level, they are self-contained, so we have to make sure that our implementation and guidance plan has strong exemplars, perhaps videos, and we also, over the course of the next year, want to bring districts and teachers and who have connected with economic industry who are already doing it well so that teacher leaders can see this in action with their students. School and district administrators, to make sure that human capital and budget allocations are made for computer science, and so that we can talk about some of those challenges. Deep dives with districts who are already engaged. How did you do it? What conversations did you have? What people did you bring to the table to make this work happen? And what were some of the ecosystems that we looked at in your backyard that helped make this work happen? And last but not least, business partners. They are ready to take ownership of these computer science initiatives because it's not the next wave of the future, it's already happening. So we have to find opportunities to bring those things into our buildings, expose our students, and make sure that they have an opportunity to choose pathways that can break generational curses and make a true difference in their careers. We also lastly want to begin to translate the standards into more accessible language for teachers, parents, students, and partners. Parents speak a very different language than teachers. Teachers speak a very different language than students sometimes. So as we move forward with this work, we want to make sure that when we put it in their hands, it's ready to go for those students and it makes sense. We want parents to be proud of this initiative so that they understand exactly the information that we're bringing to their children. We want to thank the steering committee for all of their hard work. We also want to thank everyone at Friday Institute, the Office of the Lieutenant Governor, and all of the staff here at DPI who helped us bring all of these information and implications to the table. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Hemphill, and you can all, I guess, all tell why we're so excited to have Dr. Hemphill leading this effort here at DPI. Your passion and your expertise shines through, so thank you, and Dr. Fry as well. Dr. Fry, why don't you just go ahead and come on up here as well, and then we'll open it up to questions. Dr. Oxendine?
I do.
Had one?
Thank you, Lieutenant Governor. And if I could just take about a minute of personal privilege to recognize and give a hearty welcome to Dr. Hemphill, because she is from my region. She, a couple of years ago, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, you were Principal of the Year for the Sand Hills region. So it's marvelous to see that you're still moving along. And my question, and actually you answered a question I had, Dr. Hemphill, because I was wondering how in the world will the self-contained K-5 or K-5 teacher, given the instructional time and 6.5 hours and all the demands, how are we going to get this in? Because we have standards now.
Yes.
And with standards come this expectation that I'm accountable for something.
Let me give you a good example. So in the standards document that we provide you, cybersecurity is one of the modules that we look at. And one of the things we talk about is how students can not only create a password, but also understand the ramifications of keeping their information confidential, and they understand the power that that password has to information. So when you talk about a kindergarten teacher or first grade teacher, when they log into their different programs, or if we do one-to-one or one-to-world initiatives, we're talking to that kindergarten or first grader about this is a password that connects to your information. So natural learning opportunities there, and just being able to augment and just really be the models of that in terms of finding opportunities for teachers to highlight those things and making sure that students understand cybersecurity at a very young age.
Very good. Thank you. And then another question. We looked at I think it was a kindergarten, it was a standard. It may have been K-5. And it had to do with doing something with teens. I don't remember the exact line. But and I've always had this question with regard to the wording of standards. What is important in that standard? What is the critical part of the standard? Must the student work in teams? Is that what the standard is about, and is that what we are teaching the student? But what's the most important part of the standard?
Yeah, that was a early high school standard. But the critical piece of that standard is using the appropriate tools to collaborate. So that might be using Google Drive. It might be something that's within your industry that, you know, a design product where you can actually collaborate together. The intent being that that's what they use to do this correctly. There's a different kind of thinking to construct and build as a team as opposed to building in isolation.
So both components of the standard
Absolutely.
are important, okay.
Yeah, we had the good fortune with the governor's office to do a work-based summit on computer science at Fidelity in December. And one of the key learnings we heard from the actual employees there was they lacked communication skills, but the communication skills, the public speaking skills they lacked was to pitch to their colleagues. It was not standing up here and doing this. They were fine, they had a course on that. They didn't know how to take their great idea and convince their partners how to actually implement that. And Fidelity's response was, and we're missing lots of important things because we're not encouraging our best and brightest to share their ideas. So it's a little bit of both, learning the right tools and learning how to work in a team. But both are necessary to be successful in the field.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you very much.
Anybody else? Any questions or comments? All right. Well, great. Well, Mr. Wallace, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm just trying to wrap my head around this. Is this going to be a standalone course? Will it be embedded in another? Because we have standards now. Will it be assessed? Will it be a standalone course? How would we offer that like at the high school level? Will it be semester based? Will it be like a CPR? Will it be that checkbox? How?
Right. So as Dave mentioned, we already have some CTF courses that have their own. So when we start talking about making this as a part of the North Carolina Standard Course of Study, we've got to create those courses. And with that will come accountability measures, learning protocols, indicators. And also notice that the standards are a progression chart. We know right now that we can walk through the mall and we see 2-year-olds with iPads. So we're going to have kindergarten students who may exhibit the proclivities of a 3rd grade student when it comes to these computer science initiatives. But making sure that the teacher is trained with that learning protocol, with those indicators to say they understand this and they've shown mastery. Those things would have to be created, which is why we have to go through that formal process.
If I can add quickly, the crux of the standards is that students must learn the following things, not that they must be taught in some course, right? And one of the things, we've been training teachers to teach the AP Intro to Computer Science course for the last 2 or 3 years. And working with CTE and DPI, we've realized that some people can't fit that into the year. Like there's too many hours needed to fit that into block scheduling or fit it into a certain semester. So now there's an evolution of that, which is there will be a non-AP version of that, which reduces some of the time and energy necessary to prep for the test so that teachers can get back to teaching concepts. So we think it can be just about anything, and we want it to be locally focused and have plans for that. But we need to know what students need to learn at certain places, which simply is not in the books yet. So for consistency's sake, for making sure that there is some progression and some path that tees students up for the next course or the next opportunity, we need to have a set of standards in place, because right now people are kind of dropping things in randomly and kids aren't really well prepared.
Okay, so we'll be covered under this in the CTE. Just trying to make sure. You have core, you have CTE.
Right.
And currently CTE, some of the things you already said, like the sharing, you use Google Drive, you can use Canvas, you can use SharePoint, and I keep going. The kids are already exposed to that.
Right.
Will you do a crosswalk to make sure we're not overlapping?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. That's the most important.
I think it's awesome what you're doing. I'm just trying to get myself a win.
And
I'm gonna
also,
give it a chance to offer that.
and that K-8 implementation plan is going to be critical too, because we cannot expect them to arrive at 9th grade and make a decision about which pathway. So that's where that work has to be created. It's yet to be done, but it's on its way.
And the committee had the same concern. They're like, wow, are we just going to tell everybody they have to do this too? And the agreement was, we need to find ways to make it connect to what they're already doing and not be a new burden for schools in the future.
Because it's neat.
Anybody else? Dr. Hemphill, Dr. Fry, thank you very much for all your efforts and for your passion about this. Thanks for a great report. And Mr. Chair, that wraps things up.
Well, thank you, Lieutenant Governor, and thank you for your leadership on this and for the fine recommendations. And we'd like to express our support that, so without objection, we'd like for the minutes to reflect that the board resolves to add computer science to the North Carolina Standard Course of Study, and we look forward to further updates from our staff and the Friday Institute and other stakeholders on the standards adoption process and engaging the board with updates frequently as we go down that path towards implementation in the field.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Next, we'll go to the Educator Standards and Practice Committee, led by that committee chair, Dr. Oxendine. Dr. Oxendine?
Thank you, Chairman Davis. I am Olivia Oxendine, and I chair the ES&P Committee. And joining me in that responsibility is Miss Amy White. The first item is a new business item, and this is going to be presented by, I think we have Kelly Crawford, who is going to be talking with us about the Educator Teacher Performance Assessment, known as the EdTPA, to many of our faculty members and our students who are now doing their student teaching in our UNC and private schools in North Carolina. We will also have another presentation on an assessment. These assessments do take place during the student teaching semester, known as the clinical experience, and we have a second presentation following Ms. Crawford by Mr. Ethan Taylor, and he is with ETS Praxis, and he will walk us through the Praxis Performance Assessment for Teachers, known as the PPAT. Do we have someone who is going to set that up for us? Or will we go directly to the presenters?
Directly to the presenters.
The presenters. So the presenters may come forward. Welcome.
Hi, thank you very much. Members of the board, thank you for having me here today. My name is Kelly Crawford, and I work with the Evaluation Systems Group of Pearson. We are the operational partner for the EdTPA.
Excuse me, Ms. Crawford, could you move to the microphone?
We are the operational partner for EdTPA, and I'm just here today to really provide you an update with what's going on with your EPPs across the state who are using the assessment, and of course also to answer any questions you have. So please, at any time, don't hesitate to interrupt me. I'm happy to take your questions. What I plan to cover in the short time we have together today is just a brief overview of the assessment. I know it may be have been some time since you've really looked at how it's structured and organized and scored. So just a little bit of an overview. Also include some information about our scoring and score reports, as well as EdTPA North Carolina specific data from the last 2 years for programs who have implemented and been piloting the assessment. And then lastly, I'll just cover with you some of the many resources and the support system that we have in place for your EPPs and their P12 partners as they continue to move forward with implementation of the assessment. Okay, so it's a little bit about the overview, and you of course know this, but just wanted to look at the timeline because again, this is the data that I'm going to be showing you today, are the candidate submissions that have taken place in both the 2017-18 as well as data up through about 2 weeks ago when I pulled this report. So understanding that this semester isn't quite finished with some data, it may look a little different in the summary reports. We're really looking at candidates who their programs have implemented over the last 2 years. As you know, they were required to have 30% of their candidates submit, but we are seeing much larger numbers than that in some of the programs across the state. We have also updated recently our scores that will be moving forward for here in the state of North Carolina. I'll just point out that this is available, of course, on our website as well as yours. But just a reminder that you do see some different scores here with EdTPA passing standards, because there are some differences in the rubrics and the number of rubrics in a few handbooks. So we'll talk a little bit about why that is in just a few minutes when we talk about the structure. But most of the handbooks fall into that 15 rubric handbook structure. So that's really where you're going to see the majority of the data coming from today. We have partners, of course, that provide not only the resources, the development of the assessment and all of its supporting documentation, but also support out in the field. So just quickly wanted to remind you of the designer, the owner, the current developer of EdTPA is the Stanford Center for Assessment, Learning, and Equity, of course, out of Stanford University in California. And these folks continue to develop this assessment. It's something that every year, we're looking at data, they're looking at feedback from the field, input from the field, and continue to develop resources and materials to ensure that programs have what they need as well as P12 partners have what they need when they're implementing this assessment. We also have a partner through AACTE, which is the American Association of Colleges of Teacher Education. And these folks really provide that strong support for the EPPs across the state that have adopted EdTPA. They house not only the EdTPA resource library and a platform for an online community where folks can, ask questions or share best practices, but also send out regular communications, updates, and those things. And then, of course, the last partner, as I mentioned, is Pearson Evaluation Systems Group, and we have traditionally worked with teacher licensure assessments across the country and are very proud to be an operational partner of this national performance-based assessment. That means basically that we manage two aspects of the assessment. One is the hiring and the training of EdTPA scorers, and we'll talk about who those folks are. But then we also operationalize and manage the actual platform that candidates use to submit. We manage the scoring process, and of course getting all of that data back to not only the candidate but also the program and the state. Just quickly wanted to show you, because this map has changed quite a bit since you first saw this item several years ago. The states in this map that are colored in red are states that currently have EdTPA policy or performance-based policy in place. Most of these states, similar to here in North Carolina, require performance-based assessment for that initial licensure. There are a few exceptions for program completion, but all of those neighbors of yours down here in the southeast part of the country are now requiring EdTPA or another performance-based assessment for licensure. And we have a few states here, Ohio and Texas, that are moving toward policy, as well as several states colored in a tan color that in which there is no current policy, but we have many programs using it there, often for accreditation, program review, and they're looking for a valid and reliable assessment. So we have a lot of folks out there that are in states with no policy requirement. A little bit about the design and architecture. EdTPA, being a performance-based assessment, this is really intended to take place at the culmination of a teacher's preparation or a new teacher's preparation. So it's really at the time where they have, most often already made it through several processes within their program or points within their program where they've, entered the program, where they've moved on and hit certain milestones along the program. EdTPA is really looking at their ability to plan, to assess, and plan, instruct, and assess, and make sure that they're doing that constantly with that student learner, at the center of their thinking and of their rationalization. And so it certainly doesn't measure everything, as no assessment can, but it does build upon and complement the other assessments that you'll find in any teacher preparation program here in the state of North Carolina. But again, this is something that candidates are completing during, most often, that last semester, their student teaching, their clinical practice, when they're full-time in the classroom with a mentor teacher. I'm going to show you in just a moment a list of all of the different licensure fields in which EdTPA has a handbook. Stanford deliberately designed EdTPA to be a content-specific pedagogical assessment. So although the architecture is the same across the 28 fields, right, the tasks are similar, the rubrics are very similar in what they're measuring, there are, as we know as educators, content specificities. There are nuances and best practices in each of these fields, and so you will see a little difference amongst those fields, but candidates are asked to do the same thing, whether they're in early childhood or special education or secondary math. They're asked to really highlight approximately, it's 3 to 5 days or 3 to 5 lessons, so approximately a week of instruction. And they're asked to show, again, or to really paint the context for the person who is scoring their portfolio. What does this community look like? What does this school look like? The classroom? And what are these kiddos bringing into my classroom every day? And so they base then, their rationalizations and their reflections on what they really know about those children in the classroom. So they pull together a collection of evidence of their work and commentaries. And again, although these 28 different areas do have some specificity, they are all structured and are designed the same. And here you see listed, there are several options for elementary that the state has decided, and EPPs are deciding which one to go with based on the placement that the candidate is in that's most appropriate. I'll also just mention that some of these, although they look general, I'm a science teacher myself, so I think, secondary science. Well, what if I'm teaching biology versus physics or earth science? Please know that when a candidate registers for the assessment, they tell the scorer that I'm in a 10th grade biology or an 11th grade AP physics class, so that when we match them up with a scorer, it is a scorer who has expertise in that particular area. Scorers do not score outside of their area expertise. Even if they're a dual certified teacher or instructor, they're still just going to score in that one particular area. And of course to ensure that they're as consistent and reliable as possible and familiar with the assessment. Just a little more about the subject-specific teaching and learning. So I showed you that list of all of the different handbooks. This is just to point out that every one of those handbooks has a subject-specific focus on the learning. And EdTPA refers to this as the central focus of their learning segment. And so here are just a few examples of really the highest incidence areas: elementary literacy, and then those four secondary content areas. Just so that you can see, again, there is some direction given to the candidate as within that 3 to 5 days, they need to ensure that they are covering all of those things within that central focus. And so, for instance, you look at secondary mathematics, they couldn't simply submit a lesson several days of procedural fluency, right? That it has to also include building that conceptual understanding as well as the problem solving and reasoning skills. You may have seen this before, and this is just to kind of give you an illustration, again, of how EdTPA is actually designed and structured. It is designed into 3 tasks of planning, instruction, and assessment. Each of those is weighted the same. They each have 5 rubrics, so every rubric counts, for the same amount towards their total score as well as each task. If you're looking, if you look closely at really what's measuring, you can see there that in planning, candidates not only have to show that they understand their content, but they can build those lessons sequentially to build upon one another, to make prior connections or connections to prior learning in the classroom, that they're using the knowledge of their students to make decisions. They're of course paying attention to any learning needs in the classroom, and then they're designing assessments. It may be 1, it may be 3. There's a lot of flexibility in the portfolio, but just so that they show that they do have assessments, whether they be informal or formal, to really monitor that student learning throughout the 3 to 5 days.
Could I ask a question at this
Absolutely.
point? I want to make sure that I'm following this correctly. So I understand there's several rubrics. So if we take the planning of the circle, then we've got a rubric for each of those areas.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
So that's where that's
Yes.
the generation of the rubrics.
Yes.
And is it a Likert rubric? Could you?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you don't mind, I'm just gonna skip ahead here to again kind of give you a visual. But the rubrics are designed to really show a progression of skill. And I think when I first started working with EdTPA, I thought of myself as a 21-year-old new teacher who was finishing my program. I would have said, well, I want to be at the 4s and the 5s, right? I mean, that's where I need to be. And we really programs really try to work with students to reinforce that this progression is something that may take years to develop in the classroom, right? But that they're really shooting for that level 3, so they can see what is expected of me, as I grow and as I improve in the classroom. So the level 3 across the board, if you think about scoring wise, I mean, you're with 15 rubrics, you can go anywhere from a 15 at the lowest score all the way up to a 75. 45 would be 3s across the board, and we're finding the average nationally is sitting, right there where it should be as the assessment was designed.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely. So again, going back to just the three different tasks and what they're measuring, in instruction, again, this assessment is not looking for necessarily brilliant delivery of content, right? But we're looking for how engaging is the teacher? Do they have the student's attention? Are they asking questions that deepen the learning? Are they making those, helping those kids to make connections to what they already know? And are they using that subject-specific pedagogy? Some of those best practices that we know are in each area of teaching and learning. And then lastly, your task 3 assessment is, of course, planned for back in task 1, but really what they are focusing on through this task is showing that, number 1, they know how to analyze the student learning and identify patterns in the classroom, but that they also are providing quality feedback to the students. How many papers did you get back that were a good job, or maybe something very generic in your feedback? So candidates here are asked to give feedback that is specific to the objective, that attends to both strengths and weaknesses they're seeing in the students, and they have to show examples of that on actual student work. So again, that assessment piece is oftentimes, I think, taking them, making candidates dig a little bit deeper, because they just don't often have a lot of practice with assessment through their preparation program. One last thing I just want to point out to you here, because it's a very critical component of EdTPAs, you'll notice that academic language piece is kind of connecting all 3 tasks. I don't want to say that, academic language could, of course, be an hour-long conversation, but I'll just say here that EdTPA plays a very specific focus on whether or not the teacher is thinking about and is building in content literacy into their classroom. So what that means for me as a science teacher, right, is that oftentimes my 6th graders would come into me with very little science experience in elementary. So coming into my classroom, I knew immediately that I would have to teach them vocabulary, right? Hypothesis, variable, what are those words mean? But it took me some time to also think about it's more than the vocabulary, right? It's how do we speak, how do we communicate with one another, how do we write as scientists? They're a very specific structure. A hypothesis has a very specific language structure, and students need to know that to be able to participate in the learning. So you'll see that academic language is really interwoven, and it connects through all 3 of those tasks. Any other questions about this graphic?
Other questions to my colleagues?
Okay. So we mentioned the rubrics. I just wanted to also include one note here about, this tool, in addition to other performance-based assessments, that this tool is not something that should be taken and forgotten, which I have to honestly say that, when I took my pedagogical assessment, it was a multiple choice short answer, and that's kind of what happened. I can't even really tell you how well I did on it, but with EdTPA, again, because it's providing these teachers a look at professionally, where do I want to be? That many programs across the country have designed what we call a professional growth plan. And excuse me, I'm going to skip ahead here for just a moment. But a professional growth plan. I believe many of your programs here in North Carolina and your districts are using this or a form of this, so that when the candidates come back with a score, right, that it's much more than a score, that it's really informing them about their own practice. And so we see programs in P12 districts who are working together now using something like this to really unpack those scores and to help new teachers identify their own strengths and weaknesses and where they might need support during that first, second, third year of induction and mentoring. So I get excited when I see, after programs get past the nuts and bolts of just doing this, then what can we really do with it, and how can we best utilize it? So that, again, is something that we have really seen programs here in North Carolina take off with. And I'll just mention to you, in case you had any questions about the scoring, EdTPA is scored year-round. We have rolling submission windows, and this is just a screenshot of our submission dates for next year. They do go through the summer. I just wasn't able to fit it on this screen. but really about every 2 weeks. Candidates have an opportunity to submit. So many programs may set their own kind of cohort deadline so that everyone's submitting at the same time, and it is a 3-week turnaround time from the time they submit until when they get those scores back. When the candidates get their score reports, of course, the EPPs get their program data as well as DPI. And so they are able within our system to look not only at individual candidate scores, but of course also really look at how are their different programs doing. Are they seeing, particular strengths and weaknesses within those constructs of the rubrics with their candidates and how they're performing on the assessment. So it really provides some rich data points back to the program to use for accreditation, renewal review, and really look at it in conjunction with all those other assessments they have within their program. Okay. I wanted to show you here, I pulled together just the summary data, let me say, from both the 2017-18 as well as the 18-19 academic years. And I placed that red line on there to show you that that is the proposed passing standard and how well your candidates currently across the state are outperforming or overperforming that passing standard. This is also a really valuable point of data for EPPs because they get not only their scores, but they also get a comparison of the summary data across the state of North Carolina as well as the national data. And I'm sure you know that that can be very helpful for them within those accreditation and program review processes. If you have, of course, specific questions about the handbook areas, I'll just point out that you see that one jump, that is elementary because, again, those elementary handbooks have 3 additional rubrics. And then you see that little lower score towards the end is the world language because they have 13 rubrics instead of 15. So that is the reason for the variance there in that red line.
Sure.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I just had a quick question. So this is the current NC data, correct?
Yes, sir.
Do you have this disaggregated by both gender and by race and ethnicity?
We can, so yes, and we'd be happy to work with you all or DPI to pull that together for you. Gotcha. In the results analyzer platform, they're able to disaggregate by gender, by ethnicity, and also by all of the background questions that candidates offer.
Really?
So for instance, I just had a program to ask me, do you have data that shows where within the semester, like if it's first placement or if it's second placement, if that's affecting performance.
Gotcha.
And those are some of the questions that they're asked to answer upon registration. So yes, we can absolutely be happy to get that for you.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
Do these data contain retakes?
This data does not. This data is
First time?
Yes.
One time, rather.
Yes.
That's important to know. Other questions, colleagues? You can continue.
Okay, absolutely. So a few other things I wanted you to be aware of. As I mentioned before, Scale's role in being, of course, the designer and the owner of the assessment, but beyond just the assessment, the handbooks. They have created over 150 resources to support the academic language piece, that professional growth plan, and many more. And so all of your programs who have EdCPA membership have access to this site. We also have, some supports in place to really address specific needs of the EPPs. So for instance, we found, of course, that oftentimes if we are just able to provide a space and a time that folks will come together and share their best practices or their concerns or their questions. So we have had several regional workshops here across the state of North Carolina over the last 2 years and have one currently scheduled in July where we work with Scale's National Academy members. And these are folks who are faculty members. You have several here in North Carolina that we lean on quite often who can come in and not just train about the assessment, but how they're really using that assessment to their best interest within the program. Yes, a question?
No, you can continue.
Okay. So again, I have some information I can leave with you about those regional workshops, and we'll continue to schedule those. We have monthly EdTPA coordinator calls with your programs to just really keep the ear to the ground and find out what they need, what support do they need, how can we help through that National Academy and through our partnerships with AACTE and Stanford University. And this is just the flyer. Again, I'll be happy to leave some of these with you if you're interested in coming down to UNC Pembroke on July 15th. This will be led by a National Academy member, one out of Georgia and one out of Tennessee. Unfortunately, our folks here in North Carolina were busy, so we had to bring some folks in from out of state, but we're certainly happy to have them and just to really foster and facilitate that conversation with your programs.
What institution was that again? I didn't hear.
Yes, please. Did I do something wrong at the very beginning? I need a disclaimer or something. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Any questions? I know I tried to put as much into that 15, 20 minutes as possible, but if there are any questions at all.
Marvelous. It's very intense. It took place last semester. It consumes a lot of talk time in schools of education, but it's really, really good because it's making sure that whether it's at TPA or the next presenter coming forward, PPAT, it's making sure that our teachers are hitting the ground, knowing the essentials of how to be great teachers. Thank you.
Thank
Other
you all.
questions?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask it. One is I'm really impressed by, I'm big on language, right? So I love the part where you're talking about recognizing the cultural assets that students bring. Hugely important. I love that there's some subjectivity going into this because, you know, I'm big on the stuff that just doesn't show up in a test, right, or a multiple choice or short answer. With that, though, I do wonder, like, what are the guardrails that are being built into the evaluation process, the subjective pieces that account for the different cultural perspectives of the candidates themselves, i.e., is there a way that you stipulate, just like, you know, there must be a teacher in a placement for 5 years, that they also come from diverse demographic backgrounds in order to be scorers? Because I just feel like that might also, forget the pun, that might color, right, the way that they evaluate as well. So are there any guardrails like that in there?
Yes. So, and I could get you the full response, but it really goes into our scorer training. And I apologize, I don't think I mentioned this. I mentioned they were content experts, but they are all either current, teachers in the classroom or work with teacher candidates. And the training is about 20 hours of virtual asynchronous training, and a very large portion of that is really focused on bias and eliminating bias in the process. Scorers are trained and have several supplemental documents, like there's a document called Thinking behind the rubrics that they use, that really just keeps taking them back to the rubric, right? I mean, and trying to, because as a teacher, of course, you're going to walk into this with your opinions.
Yeah, for sure.
And so there is a lot of training that scorers go through, and we have, I wouldn't say a high percentage, but a percentage of teachers that don't make it through that portion of the training. And then they also have to qualify on several portfolios and are closely monitored once they get into the scoring pool. But I'd be happy to pull together. Scale has a much more articulate explanation of the training and how they've designed that, and be happy to get that for you.
Beautiful. And I just, for my colleagues, the reason why I ask is last week, Education Week had an article, and it was actually a study. It was Michigan focused, but it basically showed that teachers of color were actually rated lower than their white counterparts, right? And so, again, all that, so much of this stuff is unconscious, right? But you always have to stay on guard for it, no matter what system we're talking about. So that's kind of where the question emanated from.
Thank you, Ms. Crawford.
Thank you all.
It was a fine presentation, and then I'll ask Mr. Taylor to come forward, and he's going to walk us through the PPAT, the praxis performance for the assessment for teachers. Welcome.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
One moment, please. Thank you. So I'm here from ETS, and I'm going to talk about PPAT. I'm going to give a bit of an overview to start. So, assessment was developed roughly 5 years ago, right around the same time as EdTPA, and it. You hear me okay? Okay. And it consisted of recruitment of many different states and educators from them throughout the development process. It's completed during the clinical experience, fall and spring. There's 2 specific submission periods that follow that clinical activity. There are 4 tasks associated with the assessment. The first one being formative, the final 3 being summative. It's an evidence-based response to prompts. Sequential development and approach includes a professional growth plan which students are able to leverage as they go into the profession. Everything's stored, submitted, and scored online, and the cost for the assessment is $300. So again, there's 4 tasks that focus on knowledge of students and learning environment, and that is formative and enables the students to demonstrate the knowledge and skills they pertain to understand the classroom regarding their students, the school, and the community. The task 1 is scored by local faculty or mentoring teachers, so they're able to work hand in hand in reviewing that. And it provides the program a voice as the student's going through the completion of the assessment. Formative piece is important as it sets the student up for the remaining part of the assessment, so it really builds upon their learning as they go throughout the completion of it. The assessment data collection and to measure student learning is the second task that we have, and within that, in this task, the students will demonstrate their understanding, analysis, and application of the assessment, and data collection to measure and inform student learning. The third task is designing instruction for student learning, and students will demonstrate their ability to develop instruction, including the use of technology to facilitate student learning. So it's not just lesson planning, but lesson design based on the first 2 tasks. And one flexibility here is that based off of the program where the student is completing, they can interchangeably either start the second task or the third task first, depending on the structure of the curriculum at the program. And then the 4th task is implementing analysis and analyzing instruction to promote student learning. And this basically is a culminating task that brings everything that the student has done thus far together. It includes a video. So the assessment's integrated into student teaching. Basically, I'm going to use an example here. Music candidates have the ability to pick and choose between middle and high school, half a semester, in different placements, so really gives that flexibility as they're completing the assessment. Ease of transition from current portfolios, easily aligns the teacher work samples and prepares the teacher for national board certification if they do decide to go that route. I know that's very big in the state of North Carolina. Embedded in the clinical experience timeline, so really it enables the student to complete. It's not disruptive, it's just part of the activities that would happen naturally throughout the progression of the clinical experience. And then connect students' daily practice with phases of the submission. So, and it's been designed for student success, fosters instructional coaching. So we encourage all communication to be taking place between the student teacher, the mentoring teacher, and the faculty to prepare them. Peer enables students to work collectively together, to really support each other throughout the completion of the assessment. Provides a formative feedback loop in that the assessment is submitted sequentially so that as they're getting scores back from previous tasks, they actually have opportunities to review that and inform them as they move forward on the next set of tasks. So it's a very, very nice feature for them to have. Extensive diagnostic feedback throughout the school report. So we could drive down all the way to we call them, there's tasks that the students submit, then there's steps within there, and students get scores at the various step levels, and they get formative feedback at all of those aspects. So they really are able to see how they're performing at a very deep, specific, granular level within the assessment. Flex on strengths and weaknesses and scoring rubrics. So again, they're able to really dive in deeply into that and understand where their strengths and weaknesses are, and the rubrics really guide them through that. There's a resubmission process if students don't meet the passing requirement, where they can go reflecting back on the last two pieces that I covered and understand where their strengths and weaknesses are, and then be able to elect to submit a task or tasks based off of that, so that they can strengthen their performance on those components of it. And lastly, we have customer service available 5 days a week, from like 8 a.m. in the morning till 6 p.m. at night. Students can reach us either by phone, email, chat, and it's very encompassing, from assisting with registration of the assessment all the way through while they're completing it, if they have questions, if they have any technical considerations that they need assistance with, we're able to help them from that standpoint too. So we're very big on making sure that the support's there throughout the entire process for the student.
Oh, yes, Ms. White, by all means.
I see the opportunity for resubmission, and I think that's terrific. You mentioned in a previous slide that there was a $300 cost associated with participating in the process. Is there a cost for resubmission?
There is per task, and it's $75 per task to resubmit.
Good question.
Yep. Yeah. So again, around student support, continuing assessment is designed to support both traditional alternate route programs equally. So providing a student is in the classroom being able to student teach, we're able to support those both simultaneously. We work directly with the states, the districts, and the classroom mentors during the implementation phase. We've been doing that for the last 2 years or so here in North Carolina, and that's all been going very well. All resources available to public access on our websites. So the test itself, the rubrics, and all the support materials. We have a library of examples out there that basically are previously submitted components or pieces of student submissions, where they can go in and they can demonstrate to them what's a stronger response and what's a weaker response, so they can gauge and get that feel. They also can get the understanding of different writing styles and all, so to help them as they're getting ready to prepare. Direct personal support from ETS. We are here in the state regularly, meeting with the various programs that are using PPAT to support them as they move forward. And then state implementation. So again, the process is facilitating meetings to support the state's goals, assist the states with the timelines. Most states, some move very quickly to adoption of an assessment. Some take a lot longer of an approach and are a lot more engaging with their various stakeholders to do so. Provide score setting, which we have done already, and the state has set the score on. Direct outreach to all the EPPs, and then we have a data tool which the institutions will be able to leverage to be able to look at scores specifically for each student that's completing it, and then also be able to analyze cohorts and programs and so forth and so on. And then successes, we have one management system that we feel is very important, so it enables all students to complete it in the same similar manner. We support all the content areas that are associated with teacher prep. The formative and summative aspect of the assessment is very important. And then we also, like EdTPA, use content-specific raters that are trained and assigned to the student. So when the student registers, they identify what content area they're completing, and they then are matched up to that. We also utilize 3 raters across the entire portfolio so that not one person is contributing solely to the final rating of it, an individual, which was very important. And then challenges, I think some states, the video permissions have been a bit of a challenge, just I think the understanding of the intent of why they're being videotaped and all that, so that's been something we have worked very closely with a lot of states. And then the lack of involvement, some states seem to move very quickly. North Carolina's been very detailed in engaging all their stakeholders, which has been very good as far as getting buy-in and acceptance and working together. Any questions?
Thank you. Questions from my colleagues? Mr. Buxton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not on the specific exams, but just a process question, so whenever the appropriate time for that is.
Process?
Just would be about both the exams, so it's
Go
not
ahead.
specific to. Okay, so one is, and thank you for the presentation, and thanks also for the one before in EPPA, which I think this is a great direction for us. How long does a candidate have to pass the PPAT or the EPPA? So if they're coming out of a school of education, is it like our content exams where they have multiple years in the field, or is this expected before?
The goal is for a candidate to complete it before they graduate. To
Right.
complete it, pass it during the semester in which they are completing their clinical experience, their student teaching. But there, Tom, you want to come, Dr. Tomberlin will pick up where I left off. I'm beginning to get in a dangerous zone here.
I'll just answer it.
Go ahead.
When I'm
But thank you, Mr. Taylor.
Are
Stay
you coming back?
close by.
Okay. Okay, so let me,
Oh, okay.
I'll,
Keep going.
my second question, well, I'll just tell Dr. Tomberlin so he can address it if he's not planning to already, which is the role of these exams in our report card and accountability for our EPPs. Thank you.
I do have a question, Mr. Taylor, before you turn it over to Dr. Tomberlin. How widely is the PPAT across North Carolina,
How widely we have most of the private institutions
private schools,
using it,
EPPA in our UNC system?
correct.
Thank you very much.
Thank
It's
you.
very helpful, very informative. Dr. Tomberlin, you're next.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So now that you know what the EdTPA and PPAT are, I would like to tell you about the implementation and policy implications of these tests.
Just a
So-
minute.
Yes, ma'am.
So that's one of your presentations? No, you're answering questions.
No,
I'm doing a very short little
I'm
presentation.
sorry, you're still on it.
And then I'll take,
Just
My
go
apologies.
right
I
ahead,
thought you
I'm
had done
sorry.
this while I was out. That's why I asked that question.
By all means.
okay. So the content, the pedagogy assessments were created in Senate Bill 599 as part of the licensure process, the kind of reformed licensure process for teachers. And so these are added in addition to a content assessment, and the law states that they have to be nationally normed and valid, and that requirement itself limited our options to the EdTPA and the PPAT. And as Mr. Taylor referenced, we had a pretty even split between our public and private institutions in the state of North Carolina. And so rather than try to choose and force one group into another test, we elected to adopt both of these assessments. Both assessments are the same cost to the educator, and that is $300. So the way we implemented these assessments was in 2017 when 599 became law. We decided on a soft launch of these assessments. And so what that meant was we required all EPPs in the state of North Carolina to administer the EdTPA or PPAT to 30% of their program completers in each year. So in 17-18 school year, And in the 18-19 school year, we've had 30% of those teachers. Now, more could take it, and we did not prevent anyone from taking it, but at least every EPP in the state had to at least conform to that number. So we've had 6,400 EdTPA participants since that time. 214, about 3% of them have retested. Now, the retesting, the test was not consequential in any way. It didn't have any impact on whether the teacher could be licensed or not. However, there is a separate statute that allows teachers who score a certain level on the EdTPA and have a certain GPA to kind of advance a couple of salary steps when they enter the teaching profession. So if under certain conditions a teacher could enter as a beginning teacher, but on the third step of the salary scale. And part of that was achieving a certain score, a minimum score on one of these content the pedagogy assessments. And so we think that's the reason behind some of the retesting, because it wasn't consequential at that time. Now, we will likely see, once this becomes consequential, September 1st, 2019, we will likely see many more people having to retest, one, for meeting the licensure requirements, or two, trying to get the salary bump at the beginning of their career. PPAT, we haven't looked at them as far as their retakes due to the low number of participants. There are only 237 as of currently that have taken it. Of course, of interest to the State Board of Education is, what is this additional test going to mean for the upfront costs for teachers to enter the profession? So what we've done here is given you a breakdown, high-level breakdown of what it costs to become a teacher for three pretty big routes to education, and that's elementary education. So if you're a regular elementary education teacher, the $300 is going to add to the current cost of the Pearson or Praxis Math and the Foundations of Reading. So an elementary teacher that's just completed a program is going to lay out about $533 in testing to be licensed, and that doesn't include any licensing costs to the Department of Public Instruction. If you're ECGC, it's a little more at $679, and then if you're a secondary content area, it's going to run you about $446 to be licensed in the state. So now to address Mr. Buxton's question, and now that I did all that, I've forgotten what you asked.
The costs are sobering. By all means, yes, Mr. Buxton.
First question is the time frame a candidate has to pass this vis-a-vis entering the profession.
So this is a great question that we're kind of grappling with as far as our policy goes. The way it's constructed, that it would be sensible for a candidate to have passed this coming out of a program. But of course, the legislature has the statute that I showed you in 599. They kind of link this pedagogy assessment with the content assessment, and of course, we know that they've given the opportunity for a candidate to attempt in the first, pass in the second for any licensure exams. So we really feel strongly that we're going to have to offer that same allowance to the EdTPA and the PPAT. So that's our thinking right now, but we're certainly open to direction if others see a different course on that.
The second question was about how this will play into accountability for our EPPs and the report card.
Right. So this, of course, is one of the assessments that's required for licensure, and the accountability model. It does not include being considered. Right. So the statute doesn't require the pass rates for the pedagogy or the content test to be a part of the accountability model. But of course, our folks in Pepsi who are grappling with this issue are considering, since that's such an important factor in the preparation of teachers, should we go ahead and include that in the accountability model? At the very least, it would be part of the public reporting we do on the EPP dashboard that we're on the hook to produce for later this year.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Board members, this information in front of you with the dollar signs in front of the digits, I think is something that we need to stay mindful of. Because becoming a teacher in North Carolina is not just going through a 4-year program and paying tuition. It includes these additional costs. And there may be others at the institutional level, specific to an institution. So it's just important that we keep our eye. It's in legislation, so these assessments must be taken. The students, candidates must complete these pedagogical assessments. But it's just something we need to keep on high on our radar screen. So thank you so much for this information. Moving along to the next item is ES&P 1. This is an item that will be taken up in closed session later today. And this is a recommendation coming from the Extenuating Circumstances Committee, and we will deal with that later. A discussion item, ES&P 2, and this has to do with some changes in policy around test code changes and also cut score changes. And Dr. Evans is ready to go.
Good afternoon,
Good
everyone.
afternoon.
Today I'm going to talk about 2 vendor updated licensure exams. And the first one is the Praxis CKT Math Subtest. And as we already know, this fulfills the math subtest for ECGC and elementary education, and also the Praxis Teaching Reading K-12 on the bachelor's level for those that want to obtain a reading specialist license. And the updates for these tests, for the CKT math test, there's a change in the test code, and that changes 7803 to 7813. And then for the Praxis Teaching Reading on the bachelor's level, there's a test code change from 5204 to 5206. And then there's an updated test cut score from 159 to 156. And this test did have a multi-state standards settings score study in March of 2019, and there were 3 panelists from North Carolina that took or participated in that study. And then you'll see that the current test codes, that the last test administration will be in August 2020, and then the new test codes that it will be available starting September 2019. So there will be overlap there, and licensure is aware of that. And then for my last slide, I wanted to just make you aware of some additional updates, and this is not a change in policy, and it has to do with the Praxis Core, which we use in this state to admit students to EPPs. And there are 3 sections: reading, writing, and math. And the update is for the math area, for the cut score. And even though there was an update to the test, the cut score remains to be 150. And all 3 of the tests have a code change, which you'll see there. And I wanted to let you know that there isn't a change in policy because it's listed in LICN 001, but it is only by the name of the test and the cut score. And since there's no change in the cut score for math, then there'll be no change within policy. The former slide, these are changes within LICN 003.
Thank you very much. Questions from my colleagues? Thank you very much, Kim, Dr.
Wait,
Evans.
Madam Chair, I do have one.
Mr. Buxton?
The change from 159 to 156, that was Praxis's change.
Yes,
After
these are
their
all
study.
vendor updates.
Got it, okay, just want to make sure.
Very good. And the last two items are consent items, two items. The first item is item ESMP 3, and the Central Carolina Teaching Initiative is the name of the initiative. This was approved by the state board, I think it was in 2017. And we have, it's a partnership between Wake County Schools and the Central Carolina Regional Educational Alliance. What we approved several years ago was to allow this, this partnership to offer the lateral entry pathway. They're coming back to the state board because the lateral entry pathway is near retirement, and they are coming back to us to ask that we approve them going to a residency model. You will see there is a notation in your material, and it says that Central Carolina Educational Service Alliance will continue to uphold and adhere to the provisions that were included in our original approval several years ago. That's assuming that we will have teachers who want to maintain the lateral entry license. And that stipulation, the service that they will continue to provide would be 150 hours of instruction and 150 hours of coaching and mentoring. So this is the essence of this consent item. The other consent item, ESMP 4, has to do with Western Governors University. This is an EPP. It has met CAPE requirements, so it does have CAPE accreditation, and they are requesting that the state board requests that the school become an approved EPP based on being accredited by CAPE. And those items, that completes my report for the month.
Thank you, Dr. Oxendine. We'll now take a 15-minute break. Let's come back together at 3:25. Okay, we are back in session and we'll now move to the Business Operations Committee, and I'll turn to the committee's chair, Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We have two actions on first reading, and our first of those two is Biz Op 1, which is the pre-approval of financial and business services policy manuals. This is an annual updating and relatively routine, and Alexis Schauss will explain it to us, exactly what we're doing in terms of updating.
Yes, this is an annual request that's made every June. It is requesting pre-approval from the State Board to authorize the Division of School Business to implement the budget and modified funding formulas in order to allocate the funds to the LEAs and implement new legislation on by the effective date. The Division of School Business has 10 days from the signing of the budget to allocate the initial allotments to the LEAs, and the State Board approval after the budget is signed does not allow us to meet that requirement. Historically, the items that are affected include legislated salary increases, pay structure changes, class size change, allotment funding factors, budget flexibility, and changes to existing funding formulas. Items that are competitive grants or require a new funding formula will be brought to the board before the implementation that we would do.
Are there questions or comments on this item? All right, not hearing or seeing any. Thank you, Alexis. Our next item, Biz Op 2, is the NC State Improvement Project for 2019-2020 new sites, in addition to the already existing sites. Sherry Thomas is here to keep us well informed on this development.
Well, I just get to say hello, and then I'm going to introduce our project director. But this is our annual occurrence within our 5-year cycle of this state professional development grant that we have from OSEP. This has been a very long-standing grant in our division and in our agency. And so this is, as you said, just a yearly thing that we do. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Paula Crawford to give you details.
Great, thank you, and welcome, Dr. Crawford.
Good afternoon. This is a process that we go through that's pretty rigorous. I will say that this year we began in the late winter, early spring, advertising or asking for individuals or teams in the LEAs to indicate interest. We started with the regional meetings, EC director meetings, about the application process, and the information was shared there. There was a narrated PowerPoint that was posted on our NC-SIP website for the North Carolina State Improvement Project application process. We also extended invitations to those who indicated interest, and they attended informational sessions during the EC Director Institute in March at the Corey Center. We had 3 of those, and then as a result of that, we received 19 applications. Those applications then those folks were invited to attend a team meeting, and we had those held in the east and the western parts of the state. There were 13 who attended these teams who attended these 2 meetings, and out of that, 6 sites were selected through the additional information that they supplied there. And we feel that they're very strong and that we'll have a good start to their implementation. And those sites were indicated were Union County IC Imagine Charter, Central Park School for Children, Watauga County Public Schools, Martin County Public Schools, and Arapahoe Charter.
Any questions or comments about this? Good news that this program continues to grow and expand. All right, not seeing anything, Dr. Crawford, thank you very much. All right, then we now move to our item for action, which is Biz Op 3, and I neglected to say at the start that we're here on behalf of, I'm Alan Duncan, we're here along with Todd Chasteen to lead this committee, in case you were wondering who we were. I apologize. On Biz Op 3 is a State Board of Education policy amendment, and has to do with the school business system modernization plan. This is the LEA Enterprise Resource Planning Modernization Policy, and you'll recall we talked a good bit for several meetings, including at our last meeting, about moving finally towards the
reaching of a contractual agreement with respect to the business system modernization, and there's some very exciting developments going forward with this, which we should stop and pause and thank our staff. There's been a lot of work that's gone into this, and so we should be grateful for all the work that's gone into it. And so there's policies that are necessary to set up how the distribution of funds will work with our LEAs, and I think Phil Emer from the Friday Institute is here to discuss the best approach. And Phil, as you walk forward, let me thank you and the Friday Institute for the support that you've provided throughout this difficult but a very important process.
We appreciate it, Mr. Duncan. So very quickly, just by way of background, recall that we issued a RFP a little over a year ago. That RFP has concluded, and in fact, we have awarded master agreements or contracts to 2 vendors. These are for enterprise resource planning systems, that is finance, HR, payroll systems that can be used in the school districts. In the documents before you, it talks about those 2 companies. One of them is a company called Cherry Road. Cherry Road is an integrator. They have brought a solution from Oracle, particularly an Oracle Cloud solution that supports, again, HR, finance, and payroll. And the second is Tyler Technologies, and they actually are both the integrator and selling a platform. Their platform is called Munis. So these are 2, publicly traded companies. Oracle Cloud and Tyler are publicly traded companies with products that are used across the country in many different school districts in many states. Actually, even Tyler Technologies is used in the state of North Carolina now, just not in schools. A good number, I think the number is over 50 municipalities use their ERP system. So we've got good answers for modern systems that met the requirements of the RFP as determined by the set of school district representatives on that panel. So now we have these master agreements. What these vendors are now doing is going out and demonstrating directly to the school districts so they can pick, essentially. We are not telling the school districts which answer they should choose. We're just suggesting that they need to get a modern solution in place. Please take a look at these couple of options that we've said grace over here at the department. And in fact, just today, we had the first district sign a scope of work and a contract with one of those vendors. And so they do, this is exactly the process. The school districts demonstrate, choose, sign an agreement. That agreement is governed by the master agreement that we've developed, meaning that there's a set of pricing and terms not to exceed pricing. We then look at it to make sure that it covers all the bits and pieces, and sign an MOU with the school districts that essentially say, hey, great, this is what we'll do to support you, including the funding we will provide. And so the topic here is the funding we will provide, and the PRC 153 that Alexis has and her team have put together. So basically what we said is there are 3 pieces that are eligible for funding. One is the one-time cost of actually doing the implementation. So essentially moving you from the existing platform you're using to one of these new ones. So what is the one-time cost of that? Moving the databases, changing work processes, integrating with all the other third-party tools that your finance, HR systems, payroll systems plug into, that one-time cost. And so for both vendors, we have their not to exceed pricing for every district for the one-time costs. So that's item 1 in the eligible expenses. Item 2 is the subscription fees for the new product for year 1, because we don't want you to be paying for 2 things. And since what we bought here are essentially managed services, cloud services, you start paying for that the minute you sign your contract. So once you have a contract, you're now paying. So we want to cover the cost of that for year 1. And then the third is a category that involves essentially and any other expenses related to a couple of areas. One, standard integration to things like your local substitute teacher management system or other things that might feed into the HR payroll finance system. And since the districts have a lot of work to do because they're the ones that are ultimately going to have to feed the data into the system and work with the new vendor, there are certain either backfill costs or consulting costs that they might incur locally that we have are also saying are eligible, but with the business system modernization director's approval, and possibly any other things that involve connecting your particular district implementation to the state, so to the state's reporting system, for instance. And so it is those three categories that are covered under the business system modernization allotments that can go to school districts.
As a byproduct of that last category, there is a reference in the policy to the what's been called or characterized as the golden template.
Yes.
Which would be a district that would require additional funding. Could you give a brief explanation of that to the board so that
Sure.
we have that?
So we had in there, so first of all, what the golden template is, or the North Carolina template is it covers both things that we only need to implement, that a vendor would only need to implement once for the state. So for instance, integrating with Orbit, with the retirement plan. We don't need to integrate it with Orbit 115 times. We only need to build that integration once. And once it's built once, we can stamp it out for every district. So that's part of a golden template. The other thing that would be part of it would be things like the base configuration. So to the greatest extent possible, we want to have a base configuration in the state. It is likely that we will have a couple of configurations, perhaps a more sophisticated configuration and a less sophisticated configuration, but our hope is to have only a few, and there will be sort of a base that districts will start with that will build upon. And so that is what we refer to as a golden template. And so all of that is stuff you pay for once. So when we built this template, we wanted the flexibility to be able to fund that through a district. However, the way that we have moved forward on that is that the Department of Public Instruction is issuing purchase orders to each vendor to support the development of the golden template. So each vendor has to develop this sort of initial template. The Department of Public Instruction is now issuing is in the process, in fact, of approving and issuing purchase orders to each vendor for that development, which we think is actually solves some challenges that we have today, right? Where it is the department that directs directs the existing accounting vendors to change things in their systems as state board policies change or law changes in terms of the way we're doing certain payroll and such. And so this actually solves the problem in the sense that we now, the department, actually have a contractual agreement with each vendor, and we are sending them money, and that's associated with a scope of work to implement a golden template. That serves as the first implementation that we stamp out, and if in the future there are changes that require some sort of reporting change or a template integration change, we have a contract vehicle to do it with from the department and a mechanism to send funding and a reason to be able to go, for instance, to the legislature and say, you have implemented a change. That change is going to cost us money. You're going to need to sort of send money, or we might say, it's a very expensive change. Perhaps if we moved a comma in a sentence here, we could turn a $10 million change into a $10,000 change. So while there's flexibility in that allotment policy to send money to a district to pay for that golden template, we're not going to have to leverage that, at least not initially.
All right, very helpful. Any questions about this policy, which will be for action tomorrow, as we've worked on this now collectively for a couple of months on this part, and obviously worked on business modernization for many months. Questions or comments? All right, not seeing anything, Mr. Eamer, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Our discussion item is BizOp 4, which is State Board of Education Policy Amendment A-Lot 003, Early Grade Reading Proficiency. I think Dr. Pam Hsu will lead us in that. And as she comes forward, if I could have a brief moment of privilege, Dr. Hsu has recently accepted a position as a professor at Appalachian State University, and She is to be congratulated. That's a wonderful position, and we're very excited for the great work we know that she will do there. We thank her for the great work she has done here, and let you know we will miss you. As we encourage your new appointment, we very much appreciate all you've done here, and we will miss you here.
Thank you very
On
much.
behalf
I
of the
appreciate
board.
it. Thank you for all your support. Tara, Dr. Galloway and I are here to bring before you the early grade reading proficiency allotment policy changes that we're asking. With the changes that we're making to the literacy plan, we need to make sure that this the policy is up to date, and currently the policy, the allotment policy has things in it that aren't in our current plan. So we're asking to come before the board to change the policy that we will keep in the allotment, that we will at least every 4 years we'll provide funding to refresh devices at $400 per device and an allotment ratio of 120 per ADM. We just wanted to see if y'all had any questions or concerns about us trying to tighten up this policy, so it's reflective of what we are actually allocating.
So as we ask for questions or comments on this, one thing to note would be this, when this came up late, because it's also part of an ongoing process, and I think the first request was, could this be voted on as an action item at this meeting? And because it was still developing at the time, we put it on as a discussion item. So I also would put to the board, I think the ideal world, the preference would be if this could be turned into an action item to vote on, if that was the will of the board. But so if I'm wrong about
That's
that, Dr.
correct.
Shue,
That
please
is
correct
correct.
me.
Thank you. Mhm.
But the nature of it was so late developing, we wanted to put it on, but we wanted to wait and see if there was enough information for the board to feel comfortable to actually turn it into an action item. So I also put that before you as part of this. Mr. Buxton, I think you had, perhaps I thought I saw a hand.
No, I said just I'm comfortable with this and appreciate the work they've done.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else have questions or comments on this? All right, not seeing any. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Your last report was one of your various easiest reports, probably.
Thank you.
Then, Mr. Duggan, without objection, we'll move this to action on first reading.
All right, our next item is update on contracts. There were both executed contracts report and a planned contracts report. At one point, as we have moved forward with this, there's been requests from the boards to just periodically check if there's a contract out there, just to make sure we do periodic checks, which we did on one of the contracts here, which was for an important matter. It's for Data Recognition Corporation. It has to do with the standard setting for the end of course test. This was an and there's nothing special to report. This was an RFP. It was put together as an RFP. There were two vendors who responded. The two vendors who responded were Data Recognition, who ultimately was awarded, and the other vendor who responded to the RFP was EdMetric, and so the contract was ultimately awarded pursuant to the specifications of the RFP to Data Recognition, and we just report to you because periodically we're asked to look as they come through, and the contracts are important. We see a high volume. Our people work very hard on these contracts, and so it's good to just watch the process go forward and do as you have asked, and give periodic reports as we go forward, particularly on contracts that matter to us in terms of the work that's going to be done, and that certainly fits that criteria. We have one requested update, and that's the agency vacancy report. And I believe Melissa Werner is here. And she is serving as our interim HR director, and we should pause here and thank her for the very hard work she's been undertaking in that task and in that role. And so we're pleased to have you here with this information, and thank you for the work you're doing in this role.
I appreciate it. So I'm sending around, I didn't get this in the packet beforehand, but this is a spreadsheet of our vacancies, and I'm going to take a not it's a little bit more than a high-level overview, so you guys can kind of understand where we are, what we're doing, what we have out there, and some of the struggles that we may be facing in the organization. So I'll wait till Deanna gets those handed out so everyone can take a look at them. So let's take a high-level overview and look at currently right now, if you were to pull a Beacon report, it would tell you that DPI has 176 openings. And of those openings, we have 61 positions that don't have any recruitment activity. However, over 50% of those positions are currently filled by temporaries. So we are performing the work, we're just performing the work using temporary expertise. So some of those other positions we're working on, and there might be some transitions, some new roles that we're working through, but right now, 50% of those are being filled by temporaries. Right now, we currently have 20 positions posted live on our websites. We are in the process of interviewing for 47 positions. So we have 47 positions with the interviewing process taking place now, which hopefully will result in the next month of having 47 hires. 13 positions have completed the hiring process or the interview process, and they're in salary administration. And what that means is they're in our HR department, and we're there working to qualify those applicants or those candidates to see what salary they qualify for, and then we're submitting the paperwork to the hiring managers to be able to present those offers to candidates. We have, of those vacancies, there are 15 positions that are filled, and why they still listed in Beacon as being vacancies is because until they start and have that start date of whatever, July 1st, they're gonna look to be vacant in Beacon. But actually 15 of those 176 have already accepted our offer and will be starting in the very near future. We have 3 positions that we've gotten the paperwork in the last couple days, and we'll be posting those by COB on Friday, so we'll have 3 additional postings out there. We have 3 positions that are in the process for approval to post. So we've gotten the new DocuSign system where we send around our PAFs that all of our leadership signs off approving those positions to be posted. We have 3 positions that are currently somewhere in that process being approved to post. Once they're approved to post, they come into HR, and then we put them into the preparing to post that we post as immediately as we possibly can. 2 positions are being reallocated. You guys are probably familiar with that, where they once were maybe an admin specialist 1, and we decided we need some type of other expertise within the, that particular unit, and they want to change that position to be able to do something else. So a new job description has to be written, a new org chart has to be looked at and taken into consideration, and then that comes to HR, and we go through the reallocation process, which up until June 30th of this year, we'll be allowed to do that without OSHR oversight. So as long as no one's in the position, we can internally reallocate those positions and to a new position, and without going to OSHR for approval. If that doesn't continue after June 30th, if it doesn't pass across the street, then that will significantly increase the time it'll take for us to get those positions allocated and posted. As you know, OSHR services 37 agencies, and so it takes them a while to get through those processes. So we're hoping that will continue, and we can continue to do that internally. There are 6 positions that are on hold for various reasons. I can't tell you. I can take a deeper dive if you want to later, but there's 6 positions on hold that we're not going to be looking to do anything with. We have 3 positions that we are waiting on updated job descriptions. So they're just making some slight changes based on whatever's going on in the unit to address some of the additional needs that they have. Once those job descriptions are submitted to recruitment, then we will post those immediately. The last 3 are with OSHR spec issues. So you know the class and comp project that OSHR has taken on as of last summer. We have 3 positions that have been misclassified that are prohibiting us from being able to recruit and get the right type of talent. Basically, we are in a collegial conversation with OSHR, trying to help them understand how these are misclassified so that we can work forward to getting them classified correctly so that we can get those posted. I want to take also to let you know, because recruitment is fluid. There's a constant ebb and flow of everything going on, and so I want you to kind of understand what we've done. I came on as the assistant HR director in February the 22nd, and recruitment started reporting under me. So I want to kind of show you some of the things that we've done and how what a great job we've done. Not saying all because of me, but we've changed some things that I think is being very responsive to the needs of DPI. So since February 22nd, 2019, we've made 63 hires. That's a lot for a state government. And I credit the HR team and I credit the hiring managers. They're doing a phenomenal job of getting their teams together and really putting the effort forward and getting these positions filled. We've also, to kind of see the fluidity here, the total separations. So since February the 22nd, we've had 48 separations. And I kind of separated these out for you guys so you can understand where the attrition is coming from. So we had 26 retirements. We've had 19 resignations. We've had one employee to go out on long-term disability. We've had one person to be separated during their probationary period. And we've had, unfortunately, one death. So as you can see, we've hired 63 since February 22nd. We've lost 48. So you're not, if you take just a myopic look and pull a Beacon report and say, here's our openings, it's going to look like we're not making any headway. But we are making a lot of headway. There's some things here going on with separations that you don't see those numbers drop that quickly. So this is kind of a high-level overview of where we are, but I hope it'll give you a good picture of some of the successes we're having, and I'll be glad to discuss it at a more granular level if you guys need.
Are there any questions or comments on this more macro level? Ms. Cammons and Dr. Oxendine.
Yes, so just to help me
Sure.
get an even bigger picture, how many positions total does EPI have? Not filled and unfilled?
Just 1,000-ish. I can't. Chloe, do you know specifically? Maria?
Yeah, it's about 1,000, but about 300 of that would be the residential schools.
So, how do we?
So residential schools is included in this because they pull up on our Beacon report. So in this is DPI proper and all 3 residential schools, all the openings across everything.
And the residential schools are about how many?
300.
So you don't know how many of those vacancies, the 176 are at the residential schools?
If I had to take a guess, I would say approximately 30.
Okay.
But I can get you if you want. Okay.
Dr. Oxendine.
I may have missed this. This is very important data, and you may have covered this already, but let me just ask for the sake of really knowing. What classifications are these 100? Actually, then we don't have 176. We really have 161 vacancies, because you were saying that.
Yes, so minus the 15.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so what job classifications are we talking about?
Dr. Oxendine, there is across the board. We have some that are administrative assistant 1s right up to education program director 3s. So it's across the gamut. I would say the large majority of it, believe it or not, fits kind of smack dab in the middle. I'd say ed program consultant 1s and 2s, accountants 2s, finance 1 and 2s, things like that.
So the education consultant 1 and 2 is.
Yes, ma'am.
Those would be the individuals who are really doing a lot of hard work with school systems.
Yes, ma'am.
Developing workshops, trainings, developing materials. Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
And one other question. You mentioned something about 3 positions are doing something with spec issues, having something to do with spec issues.
Yes, ma'am.
Would that be the same as the 3 up there, approval to post or preparing to post?
No, ma'am. The 3 with the spec issues are with OSHR. We can't do anything with those. They've made determinations of what they feel like the specifications need to be. Our expertise and experts in here are trying to, for lack of a better words, fight that with them, and that's not what we need to be able to do our work.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. White.
Can you talk about the process that a department must go through in order to reclassify a position and the flexibility that you have or do not have to reclassify positions to allow to fill positions within departments once a need is identified?
So initially, when you're interested, you have to submit a PAF, position action form, and it has to go through the approval process, asking for reallocation and to post. And that goes through deputy secretaries, hiring managers, and it can go all the way up to Mark, depending on what they're asking for. Once that's approved, it comes to us, and Jonna Stevenson is our class and compensation person. And so what she does is they will submit a job description, they will submit an org chart, and showing where this position fits within the org chart and how it looks overall within their unit and what the job duties and responsibilities are. And it's Jonna's responsibility to kind of take that position and look at it and make sure that it fits appropriately within their unit, and then also look across the organization to make sure there's not any overlap in what those job duties and responsibilities are, make sure it's a good fit organizationally, holistically, as well as within that unit. So once that she feels like that job description is where it needs to be to demonstrate what the job duties are, she basically goes in and approves it. And we change it in people admin. We go in and in OEL and Beacon and make those changes, change the job classification title and the job duties and responsibilities, so it's reflective, and anyone who pulls it up within the state system can see that we've changed that job. And now this was an admin specialist 1, but now it's an ed program analyst 2, and here are the responsibilities. So once that is done, Jonna will send. Now I am the recruiter now too. We actually are interviewing next week to replace our recruiter who left in February. So I'm doing all the recruitment stuff myself as well. So it'll come to me, and she'll let me know, so Melissa, we can post this job. And so what I'll do then is go into NeoGov, and I will do all the things that we need to do to post it so that we can get out on the state of North Carolina website to be advertised. That normally, to be honest with you, that could probably take somewhere to around 4 to 6 weeks to allocate a job, reallocate. Now that's on a good time frame, because we know our hiring managers and our folks here, I mean, they've got to do the work in the field. So sometimes doing the work in the field and getting all this other stuff done, it is not as timely as any of us would like. So if someone's really Johnny on the spot and we don't have a large backload, I'd say it's 4 to 6 weeks to reallocate a job, but usually around 3 average.
Thank you for anticipating the second part of that question with the timing.
Any other questions or comments?
One final.
Please.
Do these data give you concern?
It really doesn't. It doesn't give me concern. I see, if you look across, even outside of the state of North Carolina, in the market, in the job market, and how low our unemployment rates are, this doesn't scare me. This is just, nowadays, the way people are, they're looking for new jobs, they're looking for new opportunities. People don't stay where they used to stay. I don't see concern at all.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Werner, thank you very much. Appreciate that report. We have one last item. We have a consent agenda item, BizOp 5, which is the almost constantly on the agenda item of a certification of an NCLEA finance officer. So we have, again, one of those this month. So, Mr. Chair, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Duncan. We'll now proceed to our final committee of the day, the Student Learning and Achievement Committee, led by Mr. Buxton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm joined in this endeavor by Dr. Olivia Oxendine. We have 3 items today on our agenda, a couple consent items, and then one update item. SLA 1 is our Information Technology K-12 Standards Adoption. We've got Dr. Goodman is going to present this, or Dr. Petrie Martin. Dr. Goodman, all right. Very good, and just to organize this a little bit, in recent months, we've done permission to begin the process. This is actually adoption. So standards adoption is what we're talking about today. Dr. Goodman.
Thank you. So good afternoon, Chairman Davis, Superintendent Johnson, and board members. So I just want to, I know it's late in the day and I know we're all tired, but I'm hoping that my presentation will be short, clear, and concise enough to give you enough information to inform our committee's next steps. So today I'm here to provide an update on the standards process for our information and technology standards for students, and to share with you the committee's recommendation for your discussion today. And I'm excited to be up here to talk to you about this, because after listening to the computer science initiative this morning, there's a lot of alignment in what the committee is wanting to do with the standards for students. So I'm excited about that, especially with our DLCs for educators and administrators. They're already in place. It's like the perfect storm coming together to get North Carolina where we need to be. So in my last presentation to you in February, I believe I heard someone say, "Get her done." So I'm bringing before you what the committee has done since February. So, as shared in February, we convened a steering committee composed of district leaders, teachers, and educational partners, and we began all of this in April of 2018. We've met monthly, either face-to-face or virtually since then. This steering committee acts as advisors and planners to inform implementation of the revised standards, and they have certainly done a great job with this. In alignment to the standards review process, we've completed the review phase of the process and are here to share our recommendation from the work this committee has done with the revision phase of this work. An important, and I must say a critical question that this committee wanted to address as we move forward was, what do we need for students in North Carolina? To answer this question, the committee developed this vision. We want our students to have equitable opportunity to learn and engage in digitally enabled classrooms about the following: the digital media and information literacy, digital citizenship, you've heard that talked about a couple times today, data privacy, cyber safety, digital age skills that enable students to be college and career ready, creation, collaboration, communication, and critical thinking skills that align very well with the computer science work, and inquiry and design thinking learning opportunities. Our committee, as well as our research findings, stated that to create this learning environment for students, the current technology standards needed to be updated. The committee also found that the International Society for Technology and Education, or we refer to that as ISTE, standards for students address the vision. The ISTE standards for students were created with the intent to prepare students for the world of work and life in a future that is constantly changing. They are intended to be flexible, yet robust enough for the ever-changing digital landscape. These standards will help students become diversely skilled, nimble-minded, and technologically savvy citizens. It is late in the day. Made it to that. The ISTE standards for students, and I want to emphasize this, they do not supersede other education initiatives. They work alongside them. They support and deepen the learning derived from content area standards, the next generation science standards, and others. The ISTE standards for students are thus not one more set of standards, but rather a dynamic, useful guide supporting and deepening many other initiatives. The committee has also found that the ISTE standards for students have the potential to align with other North Carolina work related to the digital learning competencies and relevant national standards and other content standards and educator professional standards. And you probably remember this slide from February. From the North Carolina educator perspective, 88% or almost 90% survey respondents agreed that the ISTE standards represent the digital skills our students need. For this reason, the committee recommends the adoption of ISTE standards for students to replace the current information technology standards. The ISTE standards provide a support framework across the grades and for all subject areas that serve as a groundwork for what's possible in learning using technology, thus supporting other state and content area standards by emphasizing the pedagogy approaches that lead to the achievement of the skills and knowledge bases found in other standards. Today's society is experiencing an explosion of information and the use of digital resources that are radically changing what tomorrow can look like. According to the World Economic Forum, a projected 65% of children entering grade school will work in jobs that do not exist today. And I know you've heard that statement multiple times in the past year or so. Part of what we find so meaningful about the ISTE standards is their emphasis on student empowerment, which aligns nicely with our work around personalized learning. We know that students need choice for learning to be authentic and personalized. These standards provide the framework for that personalization. through the use of readily available digital tools. We expect that these standards can set the stage for students to actively engage in their own learning and to build skills needed for future success. And the end result is thoughtful, lifelong learners. The ISTE standard for students represent these 7 areas that you see on the slide. So we have empowered learner, digital citizen, knowledge constructor, innovative designer, computational thinker, creative communicator, and global collaborator. With the adoption of these standards, our committee is dedicated to the creation of crosswalks and alignment of these standards with other priorities and work in the agency, specifically around personalized learning and computer science. The committee will also plan to develop wraparound materials and supporting resources. For example, part of the committee work would be to band by grade levels. And you heard that mentioned earlier, like K2, 3, 5, and middle and high school. The committee would also recommend having a representative partner with other standards review committees to support the integration of these information and technology standards for students. So as the other areas are coming up for review and revision, we would have a representative on that team to ensure that technology is embedded within those. So just an example of what you see here, focuses on students using design processes, that's standard 4, and learning computational thinking skills and mindsets, support the depth emphasized in new math standards, the rigor and cross-subject focus of new ELA standards, and project-based vision of the next generation science standards and others. Further standards such as creative communicator and global collaborator encourage sharing, collaboration, communication, and social engagement in ways that support the new visions for rigor and broad critical thinking embedded in all the new state and content area standards. Next, I'll highlight that we have slides 8 through 14. We're not going to spend a lot of time on each one of those slides, but I have a couple that I kind of wanted to just kind of point to and highlight what it might look like in one of those grade bands. So just to kind of share with you how this is laid out, the standard is written in the white area, and in the blue area show like student actions. Truly empowering students to have a voice and choice in their learning is scary to many educators today. It's so different from the way that you and I were taught. ISTE believes, as should we, that this is imperative to set students up for future success. As ISTE says, students themselves may not be prepared to be empowered, and so need our support and a framework of progression as they build what ISTE calls their mental and emotional muscle. So for digital citizenship, I wanted us to look at kind of 2A. 2A says students cultivate and manage their digital identity and reputation and are aware of the permanence of their actions in the digital world. I think we heard a little bit of that earlier too. So in a K2 kind of classroom, what would that look like? Well, students would identify internet safety rules. In a 3-5, to build off of that, students would explain how information shared online leaves a digital footprint. And we don't want to cage our students in these grade bands, because some of these K2 students will come already prepared with this information because they've been taught at home, or in other instances, they may move up to the 3-5 grade band. So it's not kind of a lock you in that this is all you will do in K2. So by the time they get to 6th through 12th grade, students should manage their digital identities and reputations within school policy, including demonstrating an understanding of how digital actions are never fully erasable. Students analyze how social media impacts society, individuals, and organizations, and they actively cultivate a social media presence designed for future employers or schools to view. So really looking at what my digital footprint looks like online, and how my future employer may be looking at that. And again, it's never erased. And again, this is knowledge constructor, innovative designer. ISTE student standards specifically highlight probable future career skills. Design process and computational thinking are exciting components that will help our students develop a mindset of problem solving. Is that solution making a difference? If not, I need to go back and try again. Understanding how computers work is a fundamental part of computational thinker. Adding logic to that understanding forms the basis for the computational thinker problem-solving skill set. And this important literacy will allow students to communicate about technical issues in any field. So just an example with computational thinker, 5B says students collect data or identify relevant data sets, use digital tools to analyze them, and represent data in various ways to facilitate problem solving and decision making. So what might that look like in a K2 grade band? With teacher guidance, students use digital tools to segregate data and identify patterns that they represent in a variety of graphics, tables, and images. To build off of that in 3.5, they would select appropriate media to display their data to a specific audience. So they would have to know their audience and what media is going to represent that data to them effectively. As they get older, middle to high school, students collect data and create charts, graphs to display the data. Students find patterns and explore meaning in the charts, graphs, and tables, and they sort and organize items using interactive tools. And again, another is creative communicator. And we have global collaborator. And again, I was not going to do the grade band thing on each one of these for time's sake. But I have some if you want to hear some. The International Society for Technology and Education is the foremost organization in teaching technology in the classroom. As a result, the ISTE has more than a dozen quality standards for how students, teachers, administrators, coaches, and computer educators should approach technology in the classroom. They have ISTE standards for students. They also have standards for educators, and we used that as a reference when we built out the DLCs for educators and administrators. They have the standards for education leaders. They have standards for coaches. They also have computational thinking competencies for educators. And they have ISTE standards for computer science educators, and that is up for revision now through ISTE. And they describe what computer science teachers must know and be able to do to help students effectively integrate these essential concepts, which may be a potential source to help guide the work we're doing around computer science. ISTE standards for students is the most common IT standards adopted by North Carolina LEAs, and they are student-centered. Some have adopted a few of the other standards as well. And again, this slide is from our February meeting, but I wanted to point out that almost 30% of North Carolina LEAs had already reported that they had adopted the ISTE standards for students in addition to our ITES that we already have in place. So in closing, the committee requests approval from the state board to adopt the International Society for Technology and Education standards for students. In your resources on eBoard, we provided a link to the ISTE standards for the ISTE student standards. And if approved for adoption, we'd like to bring to you in July for action, including these standards in a format that's similar to DLCs for educators and administrators, because we want teachers to be able to see the connections between the two. If teachers are doing this in the classroom, students should be doing this, and how do those standards align with what the teacher is doing through the DLC, meeting those requirements. So with your permission, with your approval and permission in July, we'd like to move forward with installation and implementation. So implementation would run through the 1920 school years, and this is where the committee and our division would help build these wraparound materials for teachers, and then we would do full implementation in the 2020-21 school year.
Thank you, Dr. Goodman. Before I go to questions, one clarifying question, because you mentioned another set of standards. I want to make sure I got it right.
Yes.
Our science courses is the North Carolina Standard Course of Study for Science, not the next generation.
Okay.
Correct?
Okay.
Just
Yes.
want to make sure that's
Yes.
right. Okay. Just so we're all on the same page.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yes, sir.
board members, we have a request to approve the ISTE standards in front of us, install next school year, this coming school year, and implement the following. It's a discussion item for this month. Any questions for Dr. Goodman? Board advisors, y'all are gonna have to implement this stuff. Any, Tabari and Freebird, any questions about these standards? All right, Mr. Ford.
Question, but I just really wanted to illuminate the importance beyond even just the job qualifications, right? I think I just want to emphasize, I think these skills are integrated across every subject, and frankly, intersect with this notion of civic preparedness. It's something that when I was in the classroom, I was trying to do. I didn't necessarily know what it was, but I think about 3B, knowledge constructor. And when you look at, I think this really drives home, frankly, like when you look at the climate, right, politically, students evaluate the accuracy, perspective, credibility, and relevance of information, media, data, and other resources. These are skills they're gonna have to learn for the rest of their entire lives, well and beyond whether it makes them a more employable candidate. This is what the country needs right now. So I really just wanted to offer a ringing endorsement more than anything, but I want to key in on that.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ford. Any other questions? All right, Dr. Goodman, thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right, we'll go to SLA 2, which is we're going to come back to the computer science standards development. My apologies, I was gone for a lot of that with the conflict I had cleared with the chair. I understand, Mr. Chairman, that you may have adopted them on behalf of the board while I was gone.
We added computer science to the North Carolina Standard Course of Study
There we
in your
go.
absence.
So I don't know that we need any further discussion. I would ask board members if there's any questions you have on top of that. Again, I was not here, so you may have exhausted all that you needed. I've got one. I'm going to ask Dr. Hemphill if she'll come up for a second. And I'm just going to make sure no other questions. Okay, my one question is just kind of like the cross-cutting nature of the ISTE standards. Computer science is a cross-cutting. This is an enterprise-wide kind of initiative. Standards, licensure, lots of things. And so just would be interested to hear inside the department, Mr. Superintendent, you might want to make a comment here, how this lives kind of cross-functionally in the department, because we've got, I think, a pretty good clip envisioned in terms of standards and rollout, and so how we get curriculum and instruction and educator effectiveness and all our folks on the same page here.
Well, I'm very grateful. The DPI staff has been amazing in bringing the directors to the table and really having some intimate conversations about what will be the implications, not only with CTE, also with advanced learning, and also working with curriculum and instruction. So those are our next steps in order to identify what is computer science going to look like along those same veins, and then also understanding that there may be some other people that we need to sit down with. Of course, Dr. Goodman, as we just heard from, and understanding how we truly integrate computer science and bring those collaborative efforts together. So we're going to continue the conversations. It started with a great roundtable with the Friday Institute and the Office of the Lieutenant Governor. We're going to continue that because it is going to take an army to continue this work. When we start talking about going into the field and identifying teacher leaders as well as student leaders, we want to bring students to the table and ask them some questions as well. So it's going to be a heavy lift, but something that we're going to be able to do, assuming we can get the right people in place to do that work.
Okay. Great. We've got a governor interested in this. We've got a lieutenant governor leading on this. We've got a state board obviously very supportive of this. And so I think we'll look to keep coming back and hearing how the pace of this progress is.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay. SLA 3, we will move to, and I would ask Dr. Thomas to come up at this time. This is our policy on governing services for children with disabilities, autism spectrum disorder. This is an item for discussion. We're gonna discuss this, hear the presentation and discuss this today, and then we are planning to have action on this in August. So we're gonna have a little time between now and then, a little bit more time for the field to digest as well. So I just want you to know kind of the plan moving forward. Dr. Thomas.
Chairman Davis, Vice Chair Duncan, and Board and Superintendent Johnson, you should have in your materials for this item not only the PowerPoint that you're going to see and a lot of other information that was gathered during the public comment period, but also a Q&A that we did following a special 3-week extended period for comment that we gave to our Council on Exceptional Children's Services. because of the questions they had. So you have that documented as well. And we just wanted to provide you as much information as we could ahead of time so you could see the questions we've already answered and received from the field, and hopefully give you a little bit of perspective as you come to the table today. So I hope that helped. I really just want to say one thing, and then I'm going to introduce staff that are going to walk us through this presentation. We always have to think about the why of whatever we're doing in special ed especially, because it's got to be tied to policy, procedures, regulations. But the why of this policy change is really to provide clarity and to align us to universally accepted criteria in the area of autism spectrum disorder for the educational setting and the educational services. And with that, I would like to introduce Lynn McCord, who is our consultant for school psychology, and Heidi Carrico, who is our consultant for autism.
Thank you, Sherry. Good afternoon, members of the board, Chairman Davis, Vice Chairman Duncan, and Superintendent Johnson, and the rest of the members. Glad to be here today. I'm trying to adjust here. So again, I'm Lynn McCord. Heidi and I are going to walk through big picture items and into some of the details. And then we also have some stakeholders that are actually providers in our schools and in our community that will share their kind of insight and perspective on the recommended policy changes that we're putting before you today. And with any policy change, especially when it comes to our students with disabilities who are in fact at many times some of the most marginalized kids in our systems, we understand the types of concern that may come with that. So I want to kind of just set some grounding remarks to allow you to understand what these recommendations do not do in any way. They do not extend beyond the requirements of the federal legislation, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. They don't do any extension of that. They stay within the parameters of that legislation. And they don't in any way narrow the identification practices of our school teams in their evaluations and identification of children with autism. There are some things that they do that we did aim to do when we looked at coming to kind of piggyback off of what Sherry Thomas just shared in terms of the purpose, really to improve our alignment within the context of school services with effective practices along evaluation and identification of autism spectrum disorder. And what we know is that the federal regulations gave us a broad definition in 2004 that was published in 2006, and we are committed to staying on top of the research and understanding of our disability categories, especially those that are most prevalent in our system, and making sure that we are as aligned as we possibly can be with effective practices there. So what we did aim to accomplish in making these recommendations was to provide clarity across all of our public schools in our state to have universally accepted practices and areas to investigate when we are looking at whether or not we are dealing with supporting a student who may have autism. We know that autism is clearly on the rise. We'll share some of those data in just a few minutes. And our school teams across our state need to be able to do this as effectively as possible so that we can ensure that they are consistently applying the practices that we set forth within the policy requirements. We also aim to really increase parent and caregiver involvement. And one of those things that is required is early developmental period presence of symptoms. We do not have the luxury of being able to observe our students in the early developmental period. That is before age 3, and we start serving them at the age of 3. So what we've also aimed to do within these recommendations was to better include and clarify the need for the parent and caregiver input into the early developmental period. They are our best historical reference of these symptoms being present, and that is one of the things that we need to account for. And then the other issue that we really have seen in our practice as practitioners and in our work with our colleagues and communities is that there are gaps in services that often result from inconsistency in how we're identifying something that we know exists outside of the school building. We know that autism is something that exists. You don't have autism when you walk into a school building at 8 a.m. and then when you leave at 3 p.m., it goes away. So it exists outside of that context, and there's universal ways that we know that we need to investigate specific areas. So we aim to help schools and community providers decrease their problems with fragmented service delivery across both settings and in working towards these recommendations. Up there on this slide, we have the 14 disability classifications that are derived from the IDEA, our federal regulations. And I just wanted to kind of share some of the data. We have specific learning disabilities are our most prevalent of our students with disabilities, which I believe at our most recent April child count, we had 206,532 students, ages 3 through 21, who were identified with IEPs and with one or more of these disabilities. And so specific learning disabilities is our most prevalent. Second most prevalent is other health impairment. Our third most prevalent right now is speech language impairment. And autism is now our fourth most prevalent disability category, with intellectual disabilities being the fifth. Autism in general has moved based on our trends over time. We're seeing on average about an additional 1,300 students being identified every year in this educational classification. Our April 2018 child count had our autism prevalence at 10.5% of our total. And now you could see just within a year how the incremental percentages continues to go up. What we expect by looking at these trends is that we will continue to see an increase, and we do expect actually that in the not so distant future, autism will probably become the third most prevalent disability that we identify in our state. So just underscoring the point that I made earlier is that across our school teams, they need to be able to be clear in how they're understanding the areas to investigate, and the proposed changes are doing just that, just providing the clarity that we would like our teams to consistently apply, given that they're going to see a lot of these evaluations. They will continue to see more of them in the future, and we expect that. So the overall goal, to kind of go back a little bit to further delineate a little bit of what Sherry had referenced, although I've previously practiced for 15 years and have my own experiences with evaluations of autism, we have our stakeholders here that I think you'll be more interested in hearing from their experiences as a community provider and as a school provider. And from that lens, they'll add to kind of this goal of consistency in identification practices and what that means for our students ultimately in terms of their services, whether it be in school, in the community, or both. We have available to us what we know are the universally accepted areas to investigate that my colleague Heidi will go through in just a few minutes. So she'll kind of go through the details of what those areas of clarity are that were made to the existing policy. The rest of the time that Heidi and I will spend talking, we'll kind of logistically walk through first the federal and state definition of autism, then the required screens and evaluations related to autism, and some points of clarity and some points of addition to improve alignment, and then some points of clarity in the eligibility criteria. Then we'll allow some time for our stakeholders to provide their input and then have any questions. So that'll be what the rest of our time together will look like. Up on this slide, we have the federal and North Carolina definition of autism. Our current state definition is the exact same as the federal definition, and it remains in alignment. As we're introducing these recommended changes, there's nothing that changes with that. It's the same definition that the federal regulations give us. In bullet number 1, these are some of the key features that we know. What the federal legislation does is it gives us a broad definition, and then it asks every state to determine how they apply that through their evaluation processes and make determinations around eligibility. So based on what you see here, this is what the main bullets of what the federal legislation gives us. It tells us that autism is a developmental disability that affects verbal communication, nonverbal communication, and social interaction. And of course, if it's an IDEA disability, it would adversely affect a child's performance in school. And we need to also make sure that we are understanding that symptoms are generally present before the age of 3. So this really underscores the need for enhancing and providing clarity around understanding and investigating that early developmental period when we don't have access to the child in the early developmental period. Parent and caregiver input is critical. The other characteristics that are associated with autism are repetitive types of behaviors and interests, and rigidity or resistance to changes in their routine, and sometimes unusual responses to things in the sensory environment, whether it's visual, auditory, tactile. And so these are some other things that may also be present with autism. That's what the federal regs tell us. And then there's just an underscoring point in that third bullet that the federal legislation reminds us that if an emotional disability is the reason for a child's learning struggles, then we would not default to autism, that we need to address it under the context of an emotional disability. So it just kind of is an underscoring piece for our teams to remember if they have to tease out emotional factors and consider emotional disability instead. So this is kind of the framework we're operating within, and these are the big buckets that the federal regs give us, and the North Carolina definition also applies here. I'm going to turn it over to Heidi, and she's going to walk through some of the details related to these characteristics that we would like some additional clarity on.
Thank you, Lynn. And thank you, just as a school psychologist that worked in schools for 10 years and now being here as an autism consultant and charter school consultant, I really appreciate this opportunity personally as well. So getting into the observable features of autism. So these are really the critical components that we're going to look at when we look at autism, whether we're looking at the field at large, whether we're looking at current policy or our proposed policy. So there have to be those, as Lynn mentioned, persistent deficits in social interaction and communication, and then that restricted repetitive piece, and as you said, in the early developmental period, that needs to be present. So it's no change in the current policy versus our proposed policy, that these are still the things that we're going to be looking for. What we have proposed that we add is a motor screening and sensory processing evaluation, because when we're looking at those restricted repetitive behaviors, sensory is involved in that, and there's nothing currently in the policy that specifies how we might define that. So we really wanted to present some things to help the teams and those doing the evaluations really know how they can define those things and explore those things. As far as clarifying, the areas we want to clarify are the social developmental history. That is where we want to add some language around looking at that early developmental period. Make sure we're looking at that. Psychological evaluation. So I think there have been some questions. We're not saying don't do a psychological evaluation. We are saying yes, you still have to, current policy and proposed, do that psychological evaluation. What we're proposing, though, is that you don't necessarily have to get a global IQ score, because we know for our kids with autism that when you do those cognitive tests and the psychological evaluations, you get such splinter skills. They have extreme strengths, weaknesses, and when you put those together into an overall score, it sometimes just becomes meaningless for them. It's really better to look at those strengths and weaknesses, and it actually can underestimate often their skill level when you do that. So we're saying that that's optional. That's up to the team to decide whether or not they get that global IQ, but they do still have to do that psychological evaluation. And they also have to, I think there were some questions around the academic achievement testing. That is still consistently a required component. Nothing has changed there. In reference to the behavioral assessment related to autism, the language that we've provided to clarify there is around looking at that assessment across environments. So not just within the school environment, not just within the home environment, but are we seeing, as we talked about, autism is not exclusive to school, that we want to see that across environments, that we're seeing those characteristics of autism. As well as that you may include an individually administered assessment that is specific to autism at the discretion of the team and the professionals that are looking at that. So our current existing eligibility criteria, there's some ambiguity in the language. It states that in order to be eligible, you have to have at least 3 of these 4 characteristics. So that's the communication, social interaction, unusual responses to the sensory pieces, and the restricted repetitive patterns. We know to have autism, you have to have those first 2. You have to have A and B. So, so it may be misleading, and we feel like it lacks some clarity, and we really want to firm that up a little bit. We don't want there to be any students that may have autism not qualify because of ambiguity in the language there. All right. This is showing our proposed change. It is still in alignment with looking at those global areas under investigation that we talked about earlier. This is also still really helping us further define A and B, that communication piece and that social interaction piece. So it's really giving more details to those who are exploring that around what you can look for, instead of just saying globally impairment in communication and social interaction. We're helping provide more detail for that. And similarly, and we are, and there does need to be deficits in all 3 because it is social and interaction and communication, so you have to have all that. Similarly, when we're looking at the restricted repetitive patterns of behaviors, interests, and activities, this is really the area that is addressing the C and D in our 3 of 4 that in the current policy. So it's looking at those sensory experiences, those restricted repetitive stereotypic patterns, and 2 or more in this area is what we would be looking for in looking at those aspects. I think here really, for me, this helps better define for the clinicians and for those that are really exploring and investigating the autism pieces, the gamut of things you might look for. So it's really expanding and giving you more detail so that you're not falsely like leaving somebody out that might actually meet criterion for autism because you don't have enough information. We really want to provide that clarity for folks. All right. In reference to public comment, all of our public comments that we received were supportive. We did have some questions around wording and tweaking to wording, and we did that, and that was around wording in the social developmental history and around that behavior assessment related to autism, so we made those changes as suggested. The other feedback that we got was really more that wasn't necessarily supportive or not supportive or critical. It was just questions, and that came from the field. Those that would be doing the evaluations, especially around the sensory processing evaluations, were wondering kind of who would do it, what things would you use, how would it be done, and of course that is provided through, we provided a definition of what a sensory processing evaluation was to help clarify that as well. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how you made available the opportunity for public comment, how the proposed changes were, which vehicle did you use to,
sure.
And did you connect with any professional groups like the Autism Society of North Carolina to engage stakeholder support from them?
Sure, yeah. So we did a memo, and that went out to our EC directors and coordinators for charter schools. We advertised it in the newspaper for 4 weeks. We did face-to-face sessions in spring of 2018, both in Morganton and in Lillington. So we held those sessions. And we also reached out to various statewide agencies and stakeholder groups to seek input, and we had a stakeholder meeting that they were invited to as well. Those did include TEACH, the Carolina Institute for Developmental Disabilities, Frank Porter Graham, Autism Society, the Director of Family Services, the EC Advisory Council, the North Carolina Council for Developmental Disabilities, Exceptional Children's Assistance Center. We had parent stakeholders, and Dream, I know you had reached out to some additional, if you want to comment on that.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So in addition to that, I also made phone calls as well as sent them specific emails in regards to sharing with their families and their websites so that this information can be shared throughout the state.
So it would have been the responsibility of the Sorry, follow up?
Please,
Thank
Ms.
you,
White.
thank you, Mr. Buxton. Protocol. I'm a rule follower.
You just go ahead. The
So,
floor is
so
yours.
it would have been up to the EC division and each responsible LEA to communicate to those parents that they had an opportunity to review the revised changes or participate in the stakeholder meetings in Morganton and Lillington. So Morganton's western part of the state and Lillington is Harnett County?
Yes, correct.
So those two division directors, or those division directors.
So, no, that's not correct. It would not have been their responsibility. Again, when we sent out the proposed comments, I specifically emailed and called certain groups and who I knew were family groups and parent organizations, and asked them to place it on their website, to place it on their listservs, so that all families can have an opportunity to weigh in on these proposed changes. So it was Autism Society, it was ECAC, it was First in Families, it was also Teach was informed as well, and there's some other stakeholders that I believe, Carolina Institute with Developmental Disabilities, so that all the particular families, because this is a big change, or some change for some families, and there's some fear associated with it. So I wanted to make sure that we did our due diligence to share that information and give them an opportunity to weigh in. And that information was shared as well with Deb Zuber, who she indicated in her email that it went out to over 169 families.
Please.
On the, for the public comment summary, how many of those would you say came from parents? How many parents participated? Parents of autism students participated or offered feedback?
So I know there was at least one or two parents that I may have remember those comments, but again, I'm sharing that information out, and I can't weigh in regards to whether or not they were opposed or against, because they had that opportunity. So, and I also want to also share with one of our family groups as well, the North Carolina Council on Developmental Disabilities was also provided that information to share out with their groups as well, their families.
Other questions on process? Ms. Campbell.
So out of all of that, first of all, there was the opportunity in Morganton and Wellington for people. How were those sessions attended?
They were not well attended at all. And that the information was placed in the newspaper for 30 days.
And then all this sort of web of contacts that you dealt with. Did you get very much response from any of them?
The one response that we received from, I believe it was Autism Society, was that they were fine with this and that they shared it with their constituents, and they didn't see a problem with it at the time.
And just,
Please.
just out of curiosity, this was spring of 2018?
That's correct.
Here we are in June of 2019, so.
Correct. So.
Confused there about why that gap.
So when we initially began this process, after we received the public comment from everybody and given that opportunity, I wanted to pause for a second because I did see that there were a number of questions or concerns around the sensory piece. So in doing so, I spoke to our consultant for occupational therapy, who also was a part of this and shared this at her lead meetings, and they had opportunity to weigh in. And so they felt very clear and fine with the way everything was moving. And the concern was around, do we have evaluations and assessments? So I needed to pause for 1 second, make sure that we did our due diligence to ensure that we'd be able to provide all of the support that's needed throughout the state. In doing so, at that time, I don't have my timeline in front of me, but then we had our director at the time, Bill Hussey, left, and so just through a series of events, we are now here. This has been postponed, I think, at least now for 3 or 4 months. So we're trying to make sure that we can bring this back to the board to discuss.
Before we bring our stakeholders up, any questions about just kind of clarifying questions about the change in the 3 out of 4 to 5 out of 7 on those. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Buxton. That's what I hear most from parents, that the perception is going from 3 out of 4 to 5 out of 7 is more restrictive, and more children are not going to get services. How would you respond to that?
That's an unfortunate inaccuracy. The way that the changes are laid out is to further clarify the observable features of social communication and social interaction or behavior, and the what we call RRBs, or the restrictive repetitive behaviors and unusual sensory experiences. And in those buckets, we have them laid out this way right now, which is feedback from the field has indicated that it is very broad and can lead to some confusion when we say at least 3 of the 4 characteristics listed below, when we know that A and B go together under social communication and interaction, and restricted repetitive behaviors and sensory experiences go together under C and D. And we also know, what we know about autism is that social communication and social interaction are the hallmark features of autism. Unfortunate circumstances may lead teams in this broad stroke way of applying these criteria to identify B, C, and D and exclude A, which is not ever what we want to do when we're looking at and investigating autism. We can also say A, C, and D and leave out B, which is, again, one of the hallmark characteristics of for anyone who understands autism. We know that social communication and social behavior are the hallmark characteristics. Then we go into other things that may exist, like the repetitive behaviors and the unusual sensory experiences, but they may not exist altogether, that there's some of these features that then may present themselves depending on the child, depending on where they fall on the spectrum. But that 3 out of 5 to 5 out of 7 is unfortunate in thinking that it's more restrictive when actually it's providing deeper clarity of the communication and behavioral characteristics and the restrictive repetitive interests and behaviors.
Really kind of pair them in 2.
Yeah,
versus 4.
it's kind of like, here's your 2 buckets, and don't forget about the early developmental period, and address those as they are better aligned with our universal practices. I'm sorry, I just lost the presentation somehow.
Ms. White,
So I think, I'm sorry.
let me do a follow-up.
Sorry.
I think the computer locked.
Have you had that conversation with a parent who has this perception?
Well, we have had open stakeholder invitations to come and share through their respective groups, which unfortunately was not well attended. I've personally had lots of conversations with parents about that, but in the formal setting, we have to invite stakeholders to come and hope that they show up. And when they don't show up, reach out again. And when they still don't respond, I think I might get in trouble.
I've got some I can send your way to give you a chance to explain it.
What's that?
So, Mr. Davis, I also wanted to follow up with that comment as well. I have spoken to a parent who was concerned and informed her of why we were making these changes and to have an understanding of what was happening in the field. So, to answer that question. Can I?
Let me go to Ms. White, and then we'll come back.
Chair Davis identified my question, or made my statement for me, so thank you.
Okay. Other questions? Make sure you understand this. 3 out of 4 to 5, please. Dr.
Yes,
Ottenheim.
so is the reason for the change in the identification criteria based on over-identification or under-identification?
Neither. It's based on understanding that autism continues to climb as one of our most prevalent disability classifications, and we recognize that our schools are lacking clarity in how they're applying the current criteria. So in effect, we predict a continued climb in identification like we've seen over the past 5-year trend, probably even more. But 1,300 a year are usually coming on board with IEPs as students with autism, and we do expect that it'll probably bump out speech language impaired and become the third most prevalent very soon. And we need our schools to be able to understand this better.
And I have another follow-up.
Please follow.
And so, why would the definition of something, of autism, I would think there would be somewhat universal, it's not enough, understanding and definition of that condition. So why would North Carolina, the federal government the feds have a definition, and North Carolina, or do we have one now?
It's, the definition has remained unchanged from the federal. It's the same. The federal definition of autism under the IDEA, North Carolina's is the exact same definition.
So any conversation about a state definition and a federal definition just kind of blew my mind.
When the IDEA is reauthorized, it would be great to see that, but at this point, we're aligned with the federal definition, which gives us the broad stroke for what we understand we need to investigate.
And this is my final. Research is showing that autism is more prevalent among boys. Is that what you're finding?
Based on the research that we have available to us. I mean,
so that's consistent with much of the research.
I can pull the disaggregation by gender, but I did not bring that with me today. Sorry. In our current students with IEPs, is that what, yeah, we can provide that to you for sure.
I'd be interested.
All right,
Sure.
I'm going to do one more here, and then we're going to bring our guests.
Yes,
Make a few
thank you.
comments. Okay. Ms. Camden?
Yes, and I understand that we still have to hear from them. And I would say, like my fellow board members, I have been hearing a lot about this, particularly from parents. And you have helped me very much understand. I understand their concern, but it helps me understand what you're trying to accomplish here. So thank you, I appreciate that, and I'll probably have a deeper understanding in a minute. But as to the process, because of all this that I've been hearing, I was like, who are all these groups? Because you list a lot of them. And I discovered that one of the groups is and I'm a little confused because it's listed as two different groups, but from what I can understand, I'm looking things up, it's just one group. But this exception, the EC Advisory Council, and then there's a Council of Educational Services for Exceptional Children, and I can't see the difference between those two, but there is at least one advisory council whose purpose is to advise the State Board of Education, and I think it's one of those.
It is the first one, I believe, that you referenced.
So
Is that correct?
as a member of the state board, because I can't be an expert on any of this, and I can listen to you, but I still am uneducated and I can't ever get myself up to speed, I would very much appreciate, I think that council meets shortly, and as a member of the state board, I would very much appreciate a statement from them, since they are our council. Just that would be helpful.
So let's,
We'll provide that to
okay.
you. We'll, normally, what we do in the email regarding the proposed changes was sent to them in May of 2018, prior to their meeting in June, and they typically set the agenda. For some reason, it did not come up on the agenda, so therefore, we thought they were fine, but we could definitely share that information with them and see about a statement.
So let's come back to that after we bring our guests up as we close out. We'll
Thank
come
you.
back to that.
So
Next
yes,
step.
I would, thank you. I would like to just bring up our stakeholders and introduce our two just community lens provider and our school-based provider, Ms. Wendy Fitch, who is the lead school psychologist in Cleveland County Schools, and also coordinates all of the autism support framework within the county for the students and staff and families within the context of Cleveland County. And then Dr. Jean Mankowski is also here, and a licensed psychologist with University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill's Carolina Institute for Developmental Disabilities, and she'll bring her perspective and her work with students and families and the evaluation cycles that she's exposed to. And Wendy is licensed through this board as a school psychologist, so she will be your first speaker providing input, and Jean is licensed through the North Carolina Psychology Board.
Great. Thank you, and welcome.
Thank
Ms. Fitch.
Good afternoon. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I've worked in the field of school psychology for over 25 years. In 2009, I also became a board-certified behavior analyst, and so for the past 10 years, a large part of my work has been with children with autism spectrum disorders. As Lynn said, I coordinate our autism support framework, which includes our autism evaluation team, and I'm also directly involved in conducting assessments, participating in IEP teams' eligibility decisions, as well as IEP development and monitoring of student progress. So I work with this on a daily basis. To give you some perspective on what it looks like in Cleveland County Schools, our autism assessment team has evaluated 77 students this school year. Last year, we evaluated 89, and in 2016-17, the number was 79. This is in a school system with just under 15,000 students. Currently, we have 263 students whose primary area of eligibility is autism. So just as the numbers have shown a dramatic increase statewide, our numbers in Cleveland County Schools have mirrored those increases. When the proposed changes were released, our EC director provided us with that information. We reviewed them with our autism evaluation team, and that includes school psychologists, speech language therapists, and occupational therapists. We also reviewed the proposed changes with all of our other school psychologists and our compliance managers. Without exception, everyone was encouraged and excited about the positive results that these changes could yield for our students and families. So from a practitioner's perspective, the proposed changes to the eligibility criteria would really provide further clarity to IEP teams as we make those eligibility determinations. The enhanced specificity in the eligibility criteria would give our teams the additional structure to really frame these eligibility discussions, reducing or possibly even eliminating the potential for ambiguity when we consider all these areas. The proposed changes, I believe, would really facilitate more effective and efficient discussions for IEP teams. In addition, the proposed eligibility criteria changes would provide consistency across multiple settings, schools, clinics, private practices, and would really align IEP team considerations with those current universally accepted identification criteria for autism spectrum disorders. This alignment with the universally accepted criteria would allow for our assessments and eligibility determinations to be more readily accepted by agencies outside of LEAs, therefore improving access to other services for our students and families. And then finally, the additional required screenings and clarifications to the existing evaluation requirements, including that social developmental history clarification, the psychological and the behavioral assessment related to autism, are consistent with best practices in the evaluation of autism spectrum disorders. The addition of the sensory processing evaluation, which would be conducted by a licensed occupational therapist, will enhance that multidisciplinary aspect of the evaluation process by bringing a variety of professionals to the table to examine particular areas. From many years of working with students and families, I know that the best outcomes for students occur when there is a team committed to best practices in evaluations and making sound eligibility decisions to inform instruction and programming. I believe that the proposed changes in the autism spectrum disorder evaluations and eligibility criteria will result in teams making better eligibility decisions for students and greatly reduce the challenges that IEP teams currently face when making these decisions under the existing criteria. For me, my bottom line is what is going to produce the best outcome for students. Working with students and families on a daily basis, I can speak with assurance that the proposed changes will in fact impact students in a positive manner. I appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts on this important matter, and I appreciate your time and your consideration. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fitch.
You're welcome.
Dr. Minkowski.
Hi there. Thank you for having me today. I have a doctorate in school psychology, and since earning that, I have been on clinical faculty at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, in the Carolina Institute for Developmental Disabilities. I'm also the director of training for our LEND grant, which stands for Leadership Education in Neurodevelopmental Disabilities. It's a federally funded grant from the Maternal Child Health Bureau, in which we train allied health, medical, and psychological folks and all across disciplines to work in the field of autism and neurodevelopmental disabilities. So I ran the faculty at the psychologist and psychiatrists at CIDD have looked at this plan, and we are very much in support of these changes. We feel like we should commend the school system for updating their criteria to be more aligned with the broader field of autism and the research best practices that we're seeing out there these days. Anytime there's more clarity in making a diagnosis such as autism, you're going to have more confidence in that diagnosis from both the parents, the community, and the school providers. That clarity is going to provide you much more confidence. Secondly, it provides less confusion for parents and outside providers when there is a more aligned criteria and aligned diagnostic decision making. We feel that adding the sensory evaluation is a very important move because that's where the broader field is going. We understand that that sensory needs are paramount in many, many individuals with autism spectrum disorders. And it is those sensory difficulties that are often impairing in the classroom and in academic areas. And so having that evaluation and having those recommendations from a licensed occupational therapist really will provide better care within that realm of the needs for those children. The early developmental piece is a piece that, as a practitioner in the community, has always been a little frustrating to me because it is left out in many school-based evaluations, and it doesn't give the clearest picture from parents and from other settings besides the school. And autism needs to exist in early development. It needs to be looked at. And I think it's very important to include that parent perspective. I think it gives buy-in from the parents. I think it makes the diagnostic or eligibility criteria much more clear, especially for those who are high functioning and can maybe go to school and pass in many ways as not having autism, but then have a change or an environmental difference that exceeds their coping mechanisms, and their autism shows up in the schools in a much more prominent way. This is where I've seen a lot of the differences between a school-based diagnosis and a community-based diagnosis is when when the school-based diagnosis lacks that parental piece. I've heard that there's some worry that those of us in the broader community or in the medical community do not accept school-based autism diagnostics or evaluations, and that's not necessarily true. We often accept an autism evaluation from the school system, but I always review that, we all do, to make sure it was thorough and comprehensive. And having all of these components and having an interdisciplinary team is going to make that more the case, and it's going to be more aligned, especially with that early developmental piece and that sensory component. I was very appreciative of the no longer requiring that full-scale IQ to be a component. We see very, very frequently that individuals with autism spectrum disorder have very scattered skills in the different areas of cognitive functioning. And averaging those together and using an overall score sometimes completely misrepresents the strengths and weaknesses of that child and completely misrepresents their learning, the opportunities to best grasp onto their learning. And lastly, I just wanted to say that we all realize autism is behaviorally defined, and better defining the instruments and the behavioral assessments that are done by the school psychologists when making this eligibility decision, the more in line and the more accurate that diagnosis is going to be.
Thank you, Dr. Minkowski. All right, board members, let me get any additional questions, clarifying or otherwise, for either our two guests, our providers, or our staff. Okay.
Quickly,
Dr. Oxnard.
after the board approves, makes a decision on this change, so I suppose training in the field will come next?
That is correct. Our plan is to create a guidance document and to provide training throughout the state. We already train currently our educators anyway in the area of autism, and so we want to just ensure that all educators have access to that information.
All right, so this is here, thank you, for discussion today. We will come back in August with a meeting for action. Before that time, it sounds like there's an EC Advisory Committee meeting in June, and that what the board is requesting is for this to be on the agenda at the EC Advisory Committee meeting for some discussion, and then some report, some feedback from the advisory committee to the board.
Absolutely. That was what I referenced earlier, that we did an extended period for them to provide feedback a couple of weeks ago, and then I did a webinar to answer that, and then we had planned to follow up at the June meeting as well. So we will certainly do that and bring information back to you.
Okay, great.
If there's anything else you need in the interim, we're happy to provide that too, as far as data or resources or anything that you feel would help make a more informed decision.
Right. Ms. Thomas,
Which is-
hold
which-
on one second.
Okay.
Mr. Duncan.
I was going to suggest, because we don't have the ultimate consideration of this for the board until August, and I know the summer's not an ideal time, but would it be helpful to reach out in some way to try to reach more parents one or two times over the summer with some kind of affirmative effort to get parents in, so that we get as much feedback, number one, and also get a chance to educate those parents who have a concern, to see if, to see what their comments are as they get a firsthand presentation, as we just have, that's very helpful and thorough in terms of helping understand it. That may not be feasible, but it could be a helpful thing.
Okay, we'll certainly figure out a way to do that. It was my decision to bump this to August because we knew it was going to be such a hot item anyway. We did not want to appear that we were trying to push that through on a phone call in July, so I figured the extra 60 days of public comment period would be better for us to have information.
I've had the good fortune to work with a lot of parents of children with autism through the years, and they are tremendously involved parents, tremendously concerned parents, and often extremely thoughtful. And I think anything that we do to help them to as they deal with the various challenges they have, something that will likely be much appreciated and likely will strengthen our process.
Correct, and I believe you're hearing from the same parents we're hearing from, and it's those parents of students with that are high functioning, and their fear is this will keep them from qualifying. And I will tell you, as a practitioner, many years ago back in the field working on the autism team in the county where I was, that sensory piece was the critical piece sometimes for us making that identification for those higher functioning autism kids. So I think it's really going to support, not hurt. But I understand that fear and that worry that it's going to prevent that identification. So we will certainly take that under advisement, Vice Chair Duncan, and see if we can arrange something to get out to the public and have a parent forum. Certainly happy to do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Duncan, for that suggestion. Ms. White?
I'm sorry, one last question, because
Sure.
you
Important issue.
triggered a thought of theme that I read multiple times, and it focused and centered upon the lack of continuation of services. And so with the IEP process and a reevaluation every year, a child that's previously been identified on the spectrum, possibly under this new criteria, might not receive that categorization. But I know our EC programs in our schools, and if there's a child that has a learning disability, perhaps they might not have that classification, but certainly the school would serve. But I think that is causing a lot of the fear that students who are currently receiving services
Correct.
might
Not requalify at that reeval.
Correct. Yes. So if we can allay that fear through communication, I think.
And I would say that's true of any child with a disability anytime we go through a third-year
Sure.
reevaluation. The one piece I will add is we always must use data that's been collected over those 3 years. So we're looking at performance data. We're looking at all data and information. And when you show that that support for that student has been beneficial in that they've achieved, they've made progress, that's data we're using just as much as testing scores or a sensory support. So, and there are many students who have the categorical identification of autism but do not receive special education because they do not need that third prong, which is specially designed instruction. So,
Thank you.
sure.
Okay. Ms. Thomas, thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you to our guests for adding that dimension. We will come back in August. We'll have some formal feedback from our EC Advisory Council. We'll hear a little bit more from some parents that the department's had a chance to reach out to, and we'll come back in August for action. Thank you for a good discussion, good questions, board. Last item is an update item. As board members, as you know, K-3 reading has been a critical issue for this board, and one of our top priorities, along with our partners over in the General Assembly. There's been some questions recently about our reading diagnostic. Superintendent was able to send an email out to our local superintendents across the state recently to tell them that some information would be forthcoming on our plans for professional development for our teachers related to the reading diagnostic tool. So we just wanted to use a few minutes to get an update on where things stand. Mr. Superintendent, I can give it to you or to Dr. Shu, whichever way you'd like to do this.
Dr. Shu, I think you can confirm. I'm sorry, I don't think we can share anything publicly yet, and it's very frustrating that we can't. We've done everything on our end. We're waiting on another agency to give us some direction so we can finally sign this thing and make the announcement.
Okay, and so assuming we'll respect that confidentiality, once you are able to sign this, what comes next?
One, immediately we let everyone know, and then we work with the vendor and all the districts to make sure that any training required is put in place. And we need to be careful here because we don't want to talk about this too much. We're very, very close to the end. Again, everything on our end is done, and we are waiting on final state procurement procedures to be finalized. And Tamika and Dr. Shu and everyone involved in this, thank you all so much. This has been quite a cumbersome process, but we have been able to bring it to the end, and we're very close. As in hopefully Friday.
Mr.
Then, thank you for that update, Superintendent. Then what we would ask is that prior to the public, or even prior to our local superintendents being notified, the board would appreciate to be notified, and whatever training plan is going to be provided, that we be informed. That way we're prepared when we get questions to support your plan, and we're that much more informed and able to be united on that front.
I think that's great. How much time do y'all want in between when I tell y'all and tell the field? Can I just tell y'all simultaneously?
No, I'd say give us at least a day. Give us a day.
Okay.
Yeah.
But we'll tell the field that too.
Any other questions? We can deal with some and closed if we need to. Okay, Mr. Chairman. Well, 2 consent items. We have 2 consent items, which I always forget. One deals with our continuing education pathways, and We had this last month for discussion. It is on consent this time. We did not have any questions on this last month. We've had no feedback from the field that there are any issues with this. It's a collaboration and a decision between the department and the community college system about courses that can be counted for high school credit. That'll be on consent. And then with our ESSA practitioner advisor, and I'm losing the name, let me get you specific name, our Committee of Practitioners Advisory Council, which advises us on ESSA implementation. You will see two nominees to join the Committee of Practitioners, the New Hanover County Board Chair, Lisa Estep, and the CMS, I believe he goes by the CEO of Federal Programs, Kelly Price. Their resumes are in e-board. That's the other consent item. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Buxton. Well, this has been a productive day, and our thanks to all staff and other contributors to this work today. We will reconvene tomorrow, but at this point, we'll go into closed session, and I'll remind those that are listening that our meeting will end at the conclusion of closed session. So I now ask for a motion to go into closed session, and note for the audience that following closed session, our meeting will end. Vice Chair Duncan.
I move that the State Board of Education go into closed session to consult with our attorneys to discuss personnel matters, information that is privileged and confidential pursuant to 09 NCAC 06B.0103, confidentiality of solicitation documents, and 09 NCAC 06B.0309, evaluation, and other attorney-client privilege matters, including United States Educational Technology Purchasing Alliance versus North Carolina State Board of Education and North Carolina Department of Public Instruction, AC Buy-in Through HB versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools Board of Education, State Board of Education, Superintendent Mark Johnson et al., EB Buy-in Through AB versus Raleigh Oak Charter and the State Board of Education, and finally, Hoke County versus State of North Carolina and North Carolina State Board of Education. And as to that latter matter, as has been past custom, would ask to be recused from that discussion because of service on the commission.
Motion by Mr. Duncan. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Buxton. Dr. Townsend Smith, can you call the roll?
Mr. Buxton?
Yes.
Dr. Oxendine?
Yes.
Ms. Chemnitz?
Yes.
Mr. Keenan?
Yeah.
Ms. White?
Yes.
Mr. Chastain?
Yes.
Mr. Ford?
Yes.
Vice Chair Duncan?
Yes.
Chair Davis?
Yes. Motion carries. Let's be in closed session at 5:25. We're adjourned. Well, we'd like to know.
Who was me? I second.
What will happen is they'll call us, and then we'll be in the bar.
At the same exact time.
Excruciating.
Okay.
I mean, that was the plan all along.
Did-